Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to the Midlife Revolution. I'm your host, Megan Connor, and today I am joined by the lovely Lila Tueller. Hi, Lila.
Hey. Hello, Megan.
I'm so happy to have you here today. I've really been looking forward to this.
I've been really excited about it too. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, of course. So I first came across Lila during my faith deconstruction when I was going methodically through every single episode of the LDS discussion series on Mormon Stories podcast. And I wanted to know more about the second anointing. And Lila's interview came up in my search. And so I listened to your Mormon Stories interview. I really resonated with so much of what you said. I think our stories are very similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And then I was delighted to see you pop up on a Latter Daily Digest panel the other night. And so we decided to do this interview. So I'm so glad to be connected with you now. And I want to talk about the book that you're working on, but can you just tell people a little bit about yourself and how you got to where you are right now?
Okay. Well, I was born and raised in the church. I lived on the East Coast until I was about 8. And then my dad got called, he was 7, got called to be a general authority. And so we moved to Salt Lake City at that point. And, I had the typical Mormon upbringing, except for that my dad was he was a well-loved speaker in the brethren. He was a little bit more fun to listen to because he wasn't typical and he was a convert. So do
you mind telling us your dad's name and what position he held?
Yes, his name was Hartman Rector Jr. And he was just in the 70s, first quorum of the 70s. He never ascended any higher than that.
Well, it's pretty high up in Mormon leadership, sitting on the stand during General Conference, right? And getting to give conference talks. And what years did he serve as a general authority?
Well, he was called in 1968, I believe. I hope I'm getting that right. 1968 or 9. He was made emeritus when he turned 72, which was in, oh gosh, now you're asking me to do math and stuff.
Sorry about that.
Much later, he was made emeritus when he was 72.
So he served for probably 25 years or so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And emeritus, for those who don't know, is just basically like it's like retirement for general authorities, where they still go around and speak sometimes, but they don't have official duties for the church in general.
That's right. Exactly. He still spoke quite a bit, but it wasn't official church stuff.
And do you know if your dad ever came to San Antonio by any chance?
Very possibly. He traveled a lot. He was always gone. Yeah. That's just how I remember my childhood with him, was that he just wasn't around,
So he was serving.
He was speaking all over the place and traveling. He and my mom traveled a lot.
Okay.
More than they do now, because now they have the temporary 70s that are only called for a short period of time. And they do a lot of that traveling, but then they're done. My parents did it for years and years and years. So they'd be gone for usually their trips were about a month to 6 weeks long.
Yeah, I remember you saying that in your Mormon Stories interview, and I'm just blown away by that. So you kiddos, while they were gone for a month at a time, who was taking care of you? What was happening?
Well, it started out where my mom would kind of have us go to different homes in the neighborhood and in the ward for a month. Like, that's a lot to ask someone. Hey, will you take my kid for a month?
It is.
It's a lot. And I felt like I was a burden. I really did. Like, I got the vibe from the parents that it's like, girl, we're going to try to be nice about this, but this is really an imposition. So that, and then I think they finally got to the point where that was too hard. And so they started bringing in young married couples that would stay and kind of, house sit, babysit. They do all the things, they cook and do all the things that my mom, should have been there doing, and my dad.
So they would bring in young couples from your ward or people they knew in the neighborhood, or
It wasn't usually from our ward.
okay,
It was usually people that I didn't even know. I got to know them because they were there for a month, but it
right.
was different. Like they didn't want to burn anyone out, so they'd swap it out and go to different couples. And I just felt like they were always desperately trying to find someone they could ask to come and do that. It was a lot to ask. It's a big family. And just to walk into the middle of a family system and try to handle the schedule and just all of it,
Yeah. And I'm thinking young couples too. So how many siblings did you have?
So my mom and dad had 8 children and they adopted 1 more. So 9 total.
And where are you in that group?
I'm number 6. So yeah, there were 3 younger than me. Actually, yeah, that's right. One of them was the adopted one.
Yeah. So I'm just imagining a young couple who doesn't have any children, who probably doesn't have a lot of experience dealing with a range of ages, which I'm sure that you were at whatever time they came in, and having to, like you said, come into a family system to understand all of the relational dynamics between the siblings, to get kids everywhere they had to go, and not only that, but to care for your emotional needs and getting you food and clothing and all it just seems I'm feeling overwhelmed by that, thinking of myself, as a young person with no children coming into that dynamic and being expected to know how to handle all of those things with the parents absent. I can't imagine.
I'm sure it was really difficult for them. And of course, I'm thinking more about myself, like this sucks. But I mean, they tried to make it fun. It depended on the couple. There was always a different dynamic with them, but that was just something that I don't think other people realize goes on or went on at the time when they would be called on these trips. What happened to the kids?
Yeah, so this wasn't vacation at the time for your parents. They were called on an assignment to be gone for a month, to go speak in different areas and also to see how the church was running, right? It was your dad's responsibility to check up on the leaders, to see how things are being done.
Right.
And so this was the church taking your parents away from your family for a month at a time. And then how long would they be home between the visits?
They usually would come back and be home for like 3 months and then go again.
Okay, so it was a month on, 3 months off. And, I'm thinking about you too, thinking about my own kids and how I was as a kid also wanting to have mom and dad at home, to have conversations, to help solve problems, to be involved in your achievements and
Yes.
You're growing up. And that must have been so incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I mean, my dad didn't baptize me. Some random guy baptized me. Things like that. My dad was never with me on those daddy-daughter dates back in the day.
Yeah.
Like, I got used to keeping my feelings and thoughts to myself. Like, I wasn't going to tell this random couple what happened at school today.
Yeah.
My feelings or that was bad, I would just keep it all inside. I did journal a lot back then. But yeah, I mean, it was a sacrifice. And we thought, well, this is what people do for the church. This is the sacrifice you make. And I think my parents looked at it that way. They were making a sacrifice for the church. They were called to do it. And they probably thought that's what they should do. And I just think it was a lot to ask. Yeah. So
what age were you when he became emeritus?
I was married and had several children by then.
So it was your entire growing up and some of your young married life as well that your parents were absent.
Right.
For a lot of that time. Wow.
And he served as a mission president several times. He did it 3 times while I was young. So we would move to that place for like 2 or 3 years, depending. Since they pull him back out after 2 years. But, so it was very back and forth, back and forth. We always came back to Utah, back to Salt Lake, but not always to the same house. Sometimes a completely different neighborhood, different schools. I was in and out of schools a lot. So I had very weird friendships where it was like, I'll be your friend, but I'm going to be moving in a year. I always knew, I was going to be moving. And so, it was just, there are much worse. I'm complaining about something that I know is like mild compared to what a lot of people have experienced in their childhood. I didn't have, I don't know if I can say essayed, or anything like that. I think I did experience other things that were hard. But I know I escaped a lot of really awful things in my childhood. So I can't too sad about it,
Well, yes, and I just want to validate the fact that having parents who are absent from your life creates a giant hole, and that's no different than being betrayed in the way of having SA or some other type of thing. So what you went through was absolutely as traumatic as some of the things that I went through in my childhood, because it was an abandonment and a betrayal by the people who were supposed to love and care for you, and they just weren't there.
Yeah. I mean, when you put it that way, I can see, we can't compare.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
Trauma is trauma.
Right.
But I do think there are some that are horrific.
Sure. Have you ever come across the concept of childhood emotional neglect?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of, it's the concept that like, okay, it's easy for me to say if I was physically abused, it's easy for me to point to that and say that was abuse. But childhood emotional neglect is abusive. It's just the absence of a something rather than the presence of a something, Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah. So just moving on from your growing up, parenting experience, did you go to college, and when did you meet your husband, and take us through that time in your life?
I went to college, went to BYU because, we had free tuition there. So when I did that, I met the summer prior to my first semester at BYU. We were moving home from San Diego. My dad had been mission president there. And we went to Concord, California to hang out with my sister for a few days. And she introduced me to this boy in her ward. And that's where I met my husband. So that was, we had this brief little whirlwind thing for like 9 days. And then I went back to Salt Lake, and he stayed in California. And then we went to BYU that fall. And that's where we started dating in earnest. And we dated, let's see, we got married the following April. This was September. So, it was pretty quick. I was still 18 when we got married. Oops, you're muted.
Was he a freshman also, or had he already been to BYU?
He had been, and he had served a mission and was back and had been back for a year.
Okay.
So he was 22. I was 18, almost 19 when we got married.
Yeah. So that's kind of typical of a missionary coming back from a mission to be married within a year of coming back from your mission. That's sort of the expectation, would you say?
It was then. I think maybe it still is. But definitely, they were told, okay, guys, you've done your mission. Now you're supposed to go home and get married. Don't waste any time.
Yeah. So what were you studying at BYU?
All I did was GE, I didn't really have a major picked or anything. And then, so I only attended for 3 semesters, and then I dropped out because I had my first child, and I was really sick during that pregnancy. I couldn't get my head up off the pillow. So I quit my job and school. I just was sick as a dog. So, that just began the whole next phase, which was many years of just raising kids.
Yeah, yeah. So what job did you have at the time before you?
Oh, I worked at the little grocery store on 9th East. I don't know if you went to BYU.
I didn't, but my sister lives in the area, so I know exactly which store you're talking about. Yeah.
It was Carter's, I think, Market or something
Mhm.
back then. Carson's Market, I think. Anyway, I had a job there as a checker. I mean, that's the kind of stuff I was, capable of doing back then. I was also, after I got married, I was a secretary to one of the professors at BYU for a short time.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, those kind of jobs.
So before going to BYU, did you have some goals and dreams and aspirations about what you might want to do career-wise, or was that off the table because of the expectation to get married and be a mom and have kids?
I would say it was pretty much off the table. I think, I have to give my mom credit. Sorry, I have to have a little drink. She tried to convince me to get a degree. And I was like, no, Mom, I just want to get married and have babies. That's what I want to do, just like my older sisters had done. Some of them had gotten degrees, but they didn't use them. They just got married and had kids and didn't work. So I thought that was, that sounded fun. Now I look back and think, I should have listened to my mom. Really, really helped me later if I would have done that. I was interested in science and art. Those are my two, and I still am. Those are my two favorite topics. I'm very interested. I was really into biology, microbiology, anything having to do with geology. Love that. I loved my sorry, I'm drawing a blank. My class on not astronomy, my astronomy class. I was absolutely mesmerized by that. I really, really like that whole science topic. If I could go back and get a degree, it would probably be in that.
That's so cool. And what are you doing now?
Now, at the moment, I am focusing on self-publishing. But prior to that, I have done a lot with design and art. I have kind of a flair for that. So I've been designing fabric for several years now, since 2008. 2008 is when I first started my first collection. And I love doing my fabric design. That's like a whole other side of me, that a creative thing that I just have to have. I'm just not happy unless I'm creating something.
Yeah.
So
where can your fabrics be found?
They're sold by a company called Riley Blake Designs. That's the manufacturer. They're located in Salt Lake. But they're sold worldwide. So it's kind of online stores mostly. There are some brick and mortar stores, but it's everywhere. It's in lots of different countries. You can't just get it at a Joann's fabric.
Okay.
Like quilting quality fabrics. So and it's a little more, I don't know, it's a higher quality and they're designer. So the price tag's higher.
Yeah.
Do
they market it under your name? Like, would somebody know that it's a Lila Tueller pattern?
Yeah, they use my name on the selvage, and they'll say this is her collection for the spring. Or I usually do 2 collections a year with Riley Blake. I'm trying to bump that up, but I've been doing that for quite a while, and my designs are usually floral inspired. I love flowers. It's flowers, and I've been doing flowers for a long time. I tried to move out of it for a while, and they're like, no, you stay right there.
No, you're not going anywhere. You don't understand. It's sort of like, Barnes and Noble building their business model around selling the Harry Potter books. They're like, no, you're going to continue to supply us.
Yeah, don't think about retiring anytime soon.
Well, I would be willing to bet that my mother, and probably also my oldest daughter, has your fabric in collection. My mom is a huge, huge quilter. She goes to Houston to the quilt show with her sisters every year, and
Absolutely.
she
I've
she
been there a lot.
yeah, she worked at a quilting store in the San Antonio area. It's actually, I want to say, in Kerrville, Texas, and so she knew all of the designer names, and she was always talking about different designers. I think I heard the name Kay Fassett
Yeah.
more times growing up than I heard my own name. I'm exaggerating, but just the fact that I have a fabric designer's name in my head at all tells you how much of a quilter my mom is.
Yeah. Kay Fassett is a famous British designer, and his fabrics are amazing.
Yeah.
No, I get it.
Beautiful. Yeah, so I actually had a very brief stint with quilting. My mom enrolled me in 4-H when I was a little girl and immediately wanted me to make my own clothes, and she would make dresses for my sister and I, so she really wanted me to be a seamstress. And I think because of the fact that our relationship was very problematic all my growing up years, I developed a distaste for sewing.
Of course, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, and my young womenhood medallion project, my last one, was to make a quilt because I think I chose that because I knew if I did that, my mom would like me better.
Aw.
And I just remember being in the middle of that project and thinking, "This is nuts. I just took all this fabric and I cut it up into little pieces and now I'm gonna sew it all back together. This is insane. Why am I doing this?" I
Yeah.
wasn't enjoying it, so I never finished it. That's kind of a rabbit hole for another time. I've still told that story other places. But the good thing is that my oldest daughter has a good relationship with my mom, and she picked up sewing. She's actually quite a talented seamstress. She makes a lot of her own clothes. She's made clothes for me before, and she kind of has aspirations to open a fabric shop at some point. So I'll have to introduce the two of you. I'm sure you could geek out about fabric.
Probably, yeah, that's funny. I did a lot of sewing and all of that my whole life. I've kind of backed off of it lately, just because I'm interested in doing some other things now,
Yeah, yeah.
kind of go through stages, but I still love to design. So I just finished a collection, just barely turned it in yesterday. So it's an ongoing thing for me.
That's super exciting. Have you ever done any designs with ranunculus flowers?
Oh, I love ranunculus
They're my favorite.
all the time. I love them. Yeah, they're my favorite too. They're just the cutest little bundle of petals.
Yeah.
They're just cute.
Yeah, it seems like they never stop blooming. They just keep blooming and blooming and blooming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they have such dense heads with so
Mhm.
many petals.
Yeah.
I really love them.
Well, we kind of skipped over all of your marriage and child rearing years and everything. Is there anything that you want to go back and revisit about that, or just particular aspects of your journey from, where you are, how you ended up where you are and what you're doing now? Anything you want to go back over?
I would just say that my experience with the church was very fraught. I had a firm, what I thought was a firm testimony that it was true. I believed all of the things that we were taught, but I had a lot of questions. And so I'm kind of a what do you call it? A inquisitive person. I had a lot of things on my shelf. We talk about the proverbial shelf. Mine was really heavy because I would keep saying, "This doesn't make sense. I can't deal with this right now. I got
Mm,
I got to raise my kids and I got to do this, but this doesn't make sense and I don't like it." I didn't like the way women were treated. I didn't like that the temple ceremony where we promised to obey, because I had to do the obey part and I had to do all
mm,
the things, with the penalties and everything. And I didn't like that. I didn't like any of that stuff. And I thought, I'm going to talk to God someday. We're going to have a sit down chat. And I'm going to say, why did you set it up like this? This is horrible. But I still wasn't making room for, maybe it's not true. It was like I had to believe that it was true. My parents believed it so heartily. My dad, he He was a convert. My mom was too. And they were such missionaries in their soul. They just felt so strongly that they had found the truth that I just believed them. But there were things that that didn't sit well. So I fought against a lot of it. I had a hard time being submissive to my husband. I'll just put it that way. We just didn't, it was rocky because he was raised, both sides of his family were dyed in the wool Mormons and very traditional, trad wives on all sides. And his mother was very traditional. And so she didn't put on a pair of pants until like 1997 or something like that.
Wow.
She
That's
wore
saying
a
something.
dress and little slippers all day long.
Wow.
She was Betty Crocker, a lovely woman. Please don't get me wrong. A beautiful woman and a wonderful person. I adored her in so many ways, but she was so undaunted. And so they had her speak all the time to the young women and to the Relief Society. She was just a stalwart. And even more than my mother, because my mom was a little bit, she was like me. She would push back on things and say, leave that. No, I don't.
So I think there is that aspect of, when you're raised by your parents to believe a certain way, there is that aspect of like, well, these are my parents. They know everything, until you reach a certain age, until you get to be a teenager, you go along with a lot of what they teach you because of that dynamic of like, well, my parents have been around longer than me. They know things. Yeah. They've chosen this life over other possibilities. So this must be the right way to do things.
Yeah. You trust them.
Yeah.
You trust that they know better than you.
Right. And there's sort of this tacit understanding that like, if there was a better way to do things, my parents surely would know.
Right. Yeah. I know. So we didn't realize that they could possibly just be a victim of brainwashing or any, messaging or conditioning. So we ended up, all of us that are, on the other side now, we were all conditioned to go along, even if it didn't feel right. There was no room for boundary drawing. I was never taught about boundaries. Were you?
Nope. Absolutely not.
Never. That wasn't even a word. That wasn't a concept.
And nor was consent really, right? Because there was just the expectation of the things that the boxes that you check along the Mormon path. The expectation is that you're going to be on this path and you're going to do all of those things. So there was never a conversation about, do you want to do this?
No.
And even now that they've sort of changed the language around baptisms, I thought it was so hilarious when they started saying, my child is choosing to be baptized rather than my child is getting baptized. And I was like, 8-year-old kid doesn't have the capacity to make a choice that differentiates them so much from their family. So it's still not really a choice, even at the age of 8.
No, they're still conditioned to make that choice.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you're right about that. There really isn't consent for minors. That's not a real thing.
Right.
So even though I have a nephew who absolutely would not be baptized, which I'm really proud of him for that. But,
good for him.
Most kids are going to go along with what they're told and what their friends are doing and, what their parents tell them is right. So, yeah, I was a victim of all of that, the conditioning. My parents bought the whole thing pretty much without, my dad would push back on some things, but really he just would do it his own way. He still believed 100%. He was a true believer. This is before the internet, this is my parents joined back in the 50s, 1951, I believe.
Oh, wow.
So my mom was pregnant with her third baby and the missionaries tracked them out. But they didn't know about polygamy. They didn't know all the problems. And
oh, wow.
Couldn't find out for many, many years, any of that.
So your parents were young married people with their first child or did you say third?
Third, yeah.
Yeah. So they had 3 young children. and the missionaries tracked them out. And I'm sure the missionaries didn't teach them about polygamy or about any of the problematic things that even back in the 50s that people knew were somewhat problematic. And I can identify with that somewhat because my grandmother, my dad's mom, was tracked out here in San Antonio. Probably it was more like the 60s-ish or so. But again, not the internet wasn't available. There wasn't, there weren't anti-Mormon literature. There wasn't anti-Mormon literature out there for people to read any opposing view.
That's
So
right.
what the missionaries did was they came in and shared this faithful experience and probably told an emotional story, bore their testimony. And I think back then, probably people were a lot more trusting of those types of experiences, that someone is being genuine with you. They feel this very deeply. So I can't imagine there being a lot of pushback unless you were raised in another tradition or, taught that Mormonism was false or something like that.
Right. Right. And I think back then, I mean, we didn't have Brene Brown. We didn't have, you know, the people that are speaking out about systems that control. And they weren't talking about being self-aware. And they were talking about how emotion can affect your judgment. None of these ideas, if they were out there, there was no internet. So you had to go out and buy a book somewhere about it.
Right.
So why
go to a library?
It just wasn't widely accepted or taught at all. So what you had were like Oral Roberts televangelists out there that were using emotion to get people to join their church. And so the church did the same thing. They said, are you feeling something? They tell this emotional story. If you feel something, that's the spirit telling you it's true. Well, people just would buy that. They didn't even question it. Now people will go, wait a minute, are you trying to control me? Is this because we're taught, at least I feel like it's more available now.
Yeah. And back then people weren't talking about their emotions. And so for someone to call attention to a feeling that you were having during a missionary lesson, that was a new thing.
Yep.
And so I think people would resonate and go, oh my gosh, I am feeling something, it's probably because you just told me a really heartwarming story.
Right. And the music, like when I watch something now, I'm like, this is so manipulative. They've got this swelling music playing. There's this, the voice, the way that there's just so much now that I'm more aware of. Whereas back then, I think this was, this is when all the cults were thriving. Like the Joneses and the Moonies and all these cults were really thriving. People were joining right and left. It was kind of a time where Mormonism was it was growing by leaps and bounds.
Yeah.
Joining. Yeah.
And people didn't know the cult word back then, really. They didn't really know what a cult was or that it was harmful.
Right. No, it wasn't even really talked about. There wasn't the after, what happened after, and all these people died. That's when people were like, hold on a sec, maybe we need to take a look at this.
Yeah.
But up until then, people just lived in kind of rose-colored glass world, and so I think my dad was always seeking for truth. That was his mantra. He wanted to find the truth. And so when the missionaries came and they gave him the Book of Mormon and they told him their stories, he just bought it. And so we, as his kids, were not allowed to question it because he had paid the price. He had found it for us, right? So we were just to go along. And I believed that. I believed him.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, to have, at that time, the patriarch of the home has found the truth that he searched for his whole life. He made this life-altering decision and expected his kids to go along with it.
Yeah.
And it really resonates with me too, because that's how my ancestors joined the church as well. And that's how it got passed down through generations. My fifth great grandfather joined the church in Missouri in 1830. He was one of the first people to be baptized in Missouri. And he experienced the hardship of leaving his home, selling his farm at a loss or at, less than market value, because he had to do it quickly to then give the money to the church, move with the saints to their next location. And that happened, several times over the course of just a few years. And then finally, when the extermination order was put out in Missouri, where all the Mormons had to leave the state, he went with them, him and his small family. And because of their trudging around in the snow and the cold, trying to find a place to live or a place to stay, he got sick and died of exposure eventually.
Gosh.
And on his deathbed, he said to his children, "Promise me that you will stay faithful and that you will marry someone in the faith." And so they took up that legacy and carried it with them. And then when his son died on his deathbed, he said, "Tell my children that if they don't pay their tithing, they cannot come where I'm going." And that's the legacy that got passed down. And so this is how it perpetuates. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how it happens. You're right. It just perpetuates itself through the generations. And unless somebody is really gutsy to step away from that and break that chain, and that person will be loved and hated,
Yeah.
that's the problem. My oldest brother left the church first, and he had been all in. I mean, it was such a shock when that happened.
How old were you when that happened?
I was married. I had, I think, 1 or 2 kids. No, maybe 3 kids by that time.
So in your 20s or so, late 20s maybe?
Yeah, it would have been late 20s.
Yeah.
He and his wife first moved to Hawaii and kind of stopped going to church. And then he completely went off the rails, and he moved away, left his family. He moved to Russia.
Wow.
Started a whole new life and basically married a girl that was the same age as his daughter.
Wow.
Lived a open marriage. And now he's 75 and she's moved on to a younger guy because she's so young.
Yeah.
He's by himself now. So, you look at that and go, that didn't work out so well for you. But, he was the first one to break away. And then, one by one, we still have, out of all those kids, 9 kids, there's still 3 sisters that are in the church.
Okay.
One of them is, I would say, allegedly in the church. I'm not even sure. She's a prepper, but I don't know.
So when your brother left the church, did you initially see it as a cautionary tale of like, look, his life is falling apart? Yeah.
Oh, yes. We all thought of it that way. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And it did fall apart. And he just went off on his own. And, really, like, we were all like, don't ever do that. That's a horrible thing to do. And I do think he probably could have handled it better. Like, don't just up and leave your whole family. They adopted 4 children because he was sterile. They were adopted, and he left in the middle of the last one coming over from Czechoslovakia. He hadn't even met the kid, and he left.
Wow. So and you don't have to answer this if it's too personal, but was it sort of a faith crisis that caused him to leave his family, or were there other problems that were going on?
I think it was definitely a faith crisis.
Okay. And so his wife wanted to stay in the church, and maybe that's the reason they split up.
Yeah, she just didn't he wanted to have an open marriage, and she was going to be down for that. That's what happened. They had already kind of moved away from the church, but then she came back. I don't think she is a full believer, but she feels that it's better than, the alternative.
Yeah, so it sounds like they moved to Hawaii, sort of became inactive, maybe stopped living it for a while. He has a faith crisis and wants an open marriage because now he doesn't believe in all of these restrictions, right?
Right.
and she doesn't want an open marriage. And so once he leaves her, she kind of goes back to the church as comfort, solace, protection kind of thing.
All that.
Okay.
And she would remarry a guy, a member, and she seems to be doing well now. But that was a rough go for her.
Yeah. It sort of has echoes to me of Joseph Smith, coming to Emma and saying, let's practice polygamy, but just for me.
Yeah, not you. And you will be destroyed if you don't agree.
Right. Oh, goodness. Well, we could go down that rabbit hole, but I think we will not. So I just, what made you so gutsy then? Because you said, it's kind of gutsy to break that cycle. And you saw your brother as a cautionary tale leaving the church. So you can share as much or as little about that as you would like to.
Well, I think, that was the first thing. And then we saw it as a cautionary tale. Then I had another brother who was, he was involved with Sunstone, and he was editor of Sunstone and was involved in the September 6th. All his friends were excommunicated.
Okay, so for my listeners, a lot of my listeners are not Mormon, have never been Mormon. So can you explain a little bit about what Sunstone is and a little bit about the September 6th?
Yeah. So Sunstone was at the time a magazine that was a controversial Mormon magazine. They would talk about historical issues. This is prior to the internet. Okay. They would talk about, they had access. They had a lot of historians that were professors, were very, very intellectual. And these people would get together and have symposiums, and they would write and put articles in the Sunstone magazine. None of this was church approved. In fact, the church didn't like it. The church was very worried about this whole Sunstone movement because they were bringing up issues that they really wanted to keep quiet. So he was the editor. He was finding out all kinds of things. And I would listen to him talk to my dad and my older brother that before he left, they would have these all-nighters at the house, at my parents' house. And Paul Toscano was there all the time. And they were talking about, polygamy. They were talking about Joseph's polygamy. They were talking about scandals, all kinds of the white salamander scandal. All of that they were topics that I was listening to kind of sneakily. Like I was just there listening and absorbing all of it and thinking, what is going on? What are we talking about? Getting really nervous inside, thinking the things they were talking about were controversial and kind of scary for me, for my testimony. So when my brother, so that group of intellectuals that were involved in Sunstone and the symposiums that they would hold came under fire by the brethren, the leaders, the top 15. And they systematically, within a very short period of time, in the month of September of 1993, excommunicated 6 of them, like all at once. But they didn't do it as coming down from the top. They just had the stake, the individual stake leadership do this so that it couldn't really be traced back to leadership. But it was very much a kind of a smackdown on intellectual dialogue.
Yeah. So, and this is so typical of the way that the church operates. For my listeners, viewers who don't know, that the brethren, the 15 who control the church, will hear of a movement like this. They will not like it. And so they will direct the local leaders to conduct an investigation, a disciplinary council, and excommunication. So they're getting pressure from Salt Lake to excommunicate someone. And I saw this, just recently with Nemo the Mormon. Nemo had a good relationship with his stake president and with his bishop. They both knew what he was talking about online and that he was critical of the church, and they were okay with it for the most part. And then, the idea is there was some pressure from Salt Lake to silence him. And so they gave him this ultimatum, but they never really told him what he was doing wrong. So the local leadership, I don't think, really wanted to excommunicate him, but they were getting pressure from above. So it sounds like that's what happened with the September 6th as well.
Very much. Yeah. And these were really highly intelligent people. They were everything they were saying was documented. It wasn't, they weren't making up anything.
Right.
It was just stuff the church did not want known.
Right.
They had been hiding it for a reason. They did not want the archives to be unfolded in front of the eyes of all of the membership.
Right.
So they were causing a little bit of a rift there. So that they really did just shut down. In fact, there were talks in conference afterwards saying that intellectualism was like a bad thing, like a really bad thing. And
well, I remember my parents when we moved from South Dakota to Connecticut, and my parents were, trying to find a place to live. I remembered them specifically saying that they had visited a couple of wards and they consciously made a decision not to buy a house in this ward's boundaries because it was an intellectual ward. And I remember my parents saying, no, thank you. And that was 1986.
Yeah. So that is actually all those years building up to the September 6th when they were all excommunicated. Those were the years where, Sunstone was rolling on and things were there. There was Dialogue magazine that brought up some controversial things. And between those two, it was causing a lot of people to doubt, and just to kind of push back on the correlated material and say, this isn't really right. What you're teaching isn't really substantiated by what we're seeing in the archives. So yeah, it was causing a little bit of a problem. So it's just like anything else you've heard of where, somebody starts to tell the truth and the people that are in charge want to shut that up. And that's what happened.
Because it threatens their position, right? And it sounds like what started to happen is that some of the scholars and historians were uncovering information that was harmful to the church's truth claims and the church's narrative. And they all started to kind of get together and share information. And that's kind of what Sunstone was. It was like, I know this thing about polygamy. Well, I know this thing about Joseph Smith's past. And so they were getting together, sharing information. I'm sure that felt really threatening to the church because it's like, well, we don't want this. We don't want the general membership to know all of these things because it's threatening to, to their official narrative. And so they try to silence all of these people. And then what ends up happening is that the truth gets out anyway. And now it's published on the church website as the gospel topic essay, right? So can you maybe say, and the reason I don't know is because in 1993, I was in the middle of a ridiculously crazy time leaving home for the first time. And I had stepped away from the church for a couple of years during that time. So I didn't really know any of this stuff was going on. Not that I would have anyway, because I was in Texas and, we wouldn't have gotten, I didn't even know what Sunstone was until, maybe 10 years ago or so, So when you're growing up outside of Utah, and when you're in the church outside of Utah, we don't always get the same experience and we don't get the same information. So everything that was controversial about what was coming out at that time, if I had wanted to know about that, I would have had to go to Salt Lake and talk to some of these people. I would have had, it wouldn't have even entered my mind that there was a group of people talking about historical things in the archives or whatever, because we didn't get any of that news or information. There's no Deseret News. There's no Salt Lake Tribune in Texas or anywhere else, so we wouldn't have known that stuff was going on unless it was part of the rumor mill kind of thing,
Yeah. And I mean, it was gaining momentum. The subscribership for Sunstone, it was a struggling magazine. They were not doing super well as far as finances goes.
Yeah.
But there was this sort of undercurrent of interest in the population, especially in Salt Lake and maybe surrounding, areas where the word was getting out and people were curious. They wanted to know because one of the things that was getting out was the Book of Abraham issues.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you is kind of what were the main things that got the September 6th excommunicated? What were the main things they were saying?
Well, most of the women got excommunicated for talking about Heavenly Mother, the divine feminine.
Yeah.
That was a big fat no. We don't talk about Heavenly Mother. We only talk about the Father, right? So they got in trouble for that. Maxine Hanks.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm blanking out right now. Margaret Toscano.
Mm-hmm. And Kate Kelly wasn't part of this yet, right?
No,
that came later. Okay,
much later. She was too young.
Yeah.
There was this. These were professors. These were not well known outside of the BYU.
Outside of academia.
Yeah, they just weren't. But they were brilliant and outspoken and they were thinkers. So
I'm going to look up their names because I think it's important to say their names, and I don't know them either. So
I should. I've talked about them enough. I ought to know them all. But So basically, it was all the things that are now in the gospel topics essays. Those were the things they were talking about. And the church is now, it's part of their doctrine, although they still want to keep it on the down low. They really don't want it taught.
Yeah, they still want to control the way that information gets out. And I would say that the gospel topics essays were that effort, that they sort of put a faithful spin on things. They buried a lot of things in the footnotes, and they published them very quietly without really announcing it. And then they did a bunch of surveys. I just found this out, actually, interviewing Nathan Hinckley of the Bishop's Interview the other night. He was a sitting bishop. The church sent him a survey and said, "You've been chosen among bishops to complete this survey." And they started asking a bunch of questions about the gospel topics essays, which he didn't know existed yet.
Oh my goodness.
As a sitting bishop.
What I'm talking about, like they really wanted to keep it undercover as much as possible. It's like, if anyone ever asks, we can say, "Oh no, we have this. It's all written right here on our website, but it's buried like 5 clicks deep, and then you have to know what you're looking for to find it."
Yep.
Once again, if you're not taught, how do you know what to look for?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to share this screen just because I want people to see, these are real people. Can't go to Fair LDS, can't go to wheatandtears.org.
Right.
Oh, goodness. But I just wanted like a concise. Well, anyway, I'll just say, so Lynn Whitesides, Mormon feminist, noted for speaking on Mother in Heaven. Avraham Gileadi, a Hebrew scholar, published a new interpretive translation of the book of Isaiah. He talked about the Davidic king or the Davidic servant, which has ties to my crazy Lori Vallow case.
Yep.
So his teachings were really problematic. So it's kind of interesting because I would say that there are some people who are excommunicated for telling the truth about stuff that the church didn't want to get out. But then there were also people who were excommunicated who were kind of coming up with their own stuff and riffing. Yeah. And that's
that guy.
That actually is harmful and problematic. So sometimes I think of excommunicated people as heroes, but there are some that are not heroes. So I just want to be clear about that, right?
Yeah.
So, and then Paul Toscano was kind of the leader, right, of Sunstone a little bit.
I wouldn't say he was a leader, but he was definitely influential. He was right there in the trenches. Yeah. Seeing. She's back a full member now. Lavina. That's the one I was trying to remember.
Okay. So I just want to talk about Paul Toscano for a second because according to Toscano, the actual reason for his excommunication was insubordination and refusing to curb his sharp criticism of the church leaders' preference for legalism, ecclesiastical tyranny, whitewashed Mormon history, and hierarchical authoritarianism, which privileged the image of the corporate church above its commitment to its members, to the teachings and the revelations of founder Joseph Smith and to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I would say Paul Toscano and I agree heartily
Mhm.
on those ideas, because I talk a lot about institutional narcissism and the fact that the LDS Church operates in society as a narcissistic entity. And
I agree with you on that.
Paul Toscano was saying that in 1980,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And now we have I just have a different lens of seeing it because I grew up around narcissists. I suffered narcissistic abuse, and I've studied a lot about narcissism, and so that's the lens that I see it through. So it sounds like he was calling it basically the same thing way back then.
And he still feels that way. Paul is a believer in Joseph Smith. He's
Okay.
a believer in the Book of Mormon.
Mm,
He's a believer in the temple ceremony.
okay.
He thinks that the leadership is corrupt
Mm,
and that the way that they run things, the legalism, all of that, the narcissism, all of that, he was very critical of them and very loud and vocal about it back then. I get why they excommunicated him, because he did not mince words. He would call them out by name and tell them, that what they were doing was bullshit, so they weren't having that.
yeah.
Still holds that Joseph Smith was a prophet.
Mm,
So I'm a good friend. We talk a lot. I don't agree with all the things the way that he's come down, the way I've come down, are on different sides, but
mhm,
we do align, like you said, on those specific elements where I agree with them 100%. And he was the one that said to me, Lila, I was there in your home. He said, you and all of your siblings experienced spiritual abuse.
mm,
And it really took me back. And I said, I didn't even know the term at the time.
yeah.
I read this book, which I read, this book on spiritual abuse that someone had written. And I didn't agree with the author 100% on the way that they came down, but the spiritual abuse piece, yes, I do see that, and that it has happened. And I do think that most members who have now left can point to some kind of spiritual abuse.
Yeah.
Reason why they had to go.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's just put a pin in that for a second, because that's exactly where I want to come back to. But since we started down the path of September 6th, I just want to finish saying the rest of the people, because I think it's important. I wasn't super well educated about this. And so I just want people to know. So then Maxine Hanks, another Mormon feminist theologian, she compiled and edited the anthology Women and Authority, Re-Emerging Mormon Feminism. And then Lavina, is it Lavina or Lavina? Lavina Anderson. She edited the book Sisters in Spirit, Mormon Women in Historical and Cultural Perspective, and Lucy's book, an edition of the Lucy Mack Smith narrative, who was the mother of Joseph Smith. And then D. Michael Quinn, a historian. He documented LDS church sanctioned polygamy. Oops. Let's go back. LDS church sanctioned polygamy from 1890 until 1904, after the 1890 manifesto that officially abandoned the practice. So he was calling the church out for the lie that they had stopped the practice of polygamy after the manifesto. So of course, yeah, that would be super threatening.
Yep.
So let's go back to Paul Toscano. So he pointed out to you that you had experienced spiritual abuse. He gave you a book to read. Do you remember the name of the book?
He just put out a book called Driving Jesus. And I told him I would read it, which I did. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful story, but Paul is a sentimental guy who just loves Joseph Smith, and he loves Jesus and
Hmm.
the good things that we were taught. He wants to hold on to that until his dying day. He spoke at my brother's funeral. Actually, they wouldn't let him speak at my brother's funeral because it was held in a church. So we did it at the graveside. Paul spoke there, and he had written a poem. He and my brother Dan were really, really close. And he wrote a beautiful poem and read it. And I've asked him to get me a copy, and I don't know if he has it because he hasn't ever responded to that. But they were really tight. And so I learned about my brother through Paul, a lot of things that I didn't even know about my brother. He was so busy, and we had he's 5 years older than me. I had gotten married so young that he was out doing Sunstone and all his stuff. And I was kind of like married mode, baby mode.
Yeah.
Paying attention to all the things that he was involved in and doing with Sunstone. But what ended up happening is he was called in to be interviewed at the same time as the others, the September 6th. He would have been the number 7. Actually, Margaret was number 7, Paul's wife. She was excommunicated a few months later. Okay. But my brother Dan was called in at the same time, and they did not excommunicate him. They disfellowshipped him. His temple recommend. He couldn't teach. He was teaching gospel doctrine. They took that away. So they punished him for being involved. And then he got a phone call from Boyd K. Packer, where Boyd Packer issued an apostolic curse.
I remember this story. Yes, I remember you telling this. Yes, please tell us about this because this is wild.
It's just so. I'm just so appalled. Anyway.
It's literally a leader of the church saying, "I curse you."
Yeah. Because he didn't like that Dan was going to continue with Sunstone. Even though they threatened him up and down to leave, he wasn't going to until he finally did because they weren't paying him enough. He couldn't live on it. But Boyd K. Packer calls and says, I want you to stop doing this. I want you to stop. Just make Sunstone go away. You're causing problems with your father. People are confusing the two of you because Dan's name is Daniel Hartman Rector. So they were saying, it's too closely tied together. People are getting confused. Is Hartman Rector doing Sunstone? Yeah. So anyway, Dan said, as nicely as I heard this story from him. So this is his spin. He said, as nicely as he could, he said, I understand why you want us to stop, but I feel like we need this forum. We need this platform. There are too many people with questions, and you can't just make it go away. They need to have a place to talk and openly discuss, because you couldn't do that in Sunday school.
Right.
Do it anywhere. So Dan was just, he was just sort of jockeying for that opportunity to continue with that platform for people who were interested and had questions. And he said, if you don't do it, he said, I'm speaking as an apostle right now. And I invoke, what did he say? I had to get the wording from my brother. But basically he said that it was an apostolic curse, and that if he did not, and he said he would reap disappointment and adversity for the rest of his life.
Did he say, I pronounce upon you an apostolic curse?
I don't remember.
I seem to remember, as part of your Mormon stories, interview, sometimes those phrases stick in my mind. So anyway, I don't know if that's correct, but
he definitely made it known that he was speaking as an apostle, and he was bringing down, a curse on him. Like, he would reap adversity for all his days. So, and then he died so young. It was like, what? What just happened? So, I don't know. Anyway.
So this brings up so much cognitive dissonance for me, because we are taught that the apostles and the quorum of the 12 apostles who help lead the church are special witnesses of Jesus Christ. We are taught that they communicate directly with Jesus Christ, that they are representative of him, that they know him intimately, that they know him better than anyone else does. And so to have someone whose authority is being threatened, whose official narrative is being threatened, to have that person curse someone, use their priesthood power, I'm always going to say priesthood power, to curse someone. Is that what Jesus would have done? Is that what one of the 12 apostles who were on the earth when Jesus was on the earth, is that what they would have done if somebody was no. I mean, what Paul did was he wrote letters to people. If they were, doing something bad, he would write them a letter and say, hey, stop it. That's not what Jesus taught, So I'm curious too about one other point. Why do you think it is that your brother was not excommunicated at the time? Why was he only disfellowshipped at the time?
Well, I think he went in with a really humble, knowing my brother. I know that it's tricky. I'm not sure. I should just say that. I don't really know why they came down on, the side that they came down. But I have my suspicions. And I think Dan was he was such a sweet person. He never meant anyone harm. Like, he would take spiders outside and let them go. He would catch a fly and set it free. Like, he couldn't harm anything. And so I think what he said was, I'm sorry that if I feel like I've offended you guys, I'm just trying to make a space for people to talk about concerns. And we want to talk about, we love the church. We love the doctrine. We want to talk about it more. We want more information. It's not that we're trying to bring the church down, because I don't think any of them really were. I don't think that was the goal. They just wanted to talk about things. And they knew things that weren't being taught. So we wanted to discuss that. And I think maybe because of my dad, I think my dad had some influence there.
Okay.
I think they realized that it would look really bad if Hartman Rector Jr.'s son was excommunicated. I think they just took a lot of things into consideration before they made that decision.
Yeah. So then how long, I know you probably said already, but how long after the disciplinary council did he receive his apostolic curse?
I think it was before that.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So Boyd Packer cursed Dan, and then he went into a disciplinary council and they didn't excommunicate him.
Right.
I find that really interesting.
Yeah. And like I said, I think there were more voices involved in whether they excommunicated or not, these guys. And maybe because my dad was a general authority, I think that must have played into it.
Yeah. Maybe somebody at Boyd K. Packer's level talked him down a little bit and said, look, we can't excommunicate this guy, and here are the reasons why. And that got filtered down to the stake presidency.
Right. He hadn't broken any of the commandments. Like, he hadn't done anything wrong that they could really cite. Dan wasn't even speaking. He was the editor. He wasn't doing the articles himself. He was involved in all of it, but he wasn't the one that was complaining about things. He wasn't talking about Mother in Heaven. He wasn't talking. So really they couldn't, the only thing they could do is guilt by association, really. So.
Yeah, so he was just creating a space for people to have the conversation. He wasn't the one having the conversation. So maybe that was a part of it as well. Okay. And so then, I obviously don't, talk about anything that you don't feel comfortable talking about, but you said that he died young.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious about how old he was and how he died, just from the standpoint that, that must have been really, really awful for you.
Oh, it was. It was. It was. He was I adored my brother. We were very close, and I looked up to him. I thought the world of my brother. And he was a good brother and a really good uncle to my kids. Anyway, he was 46. He was an avid outdoor enthusiast, and he did this morning hike every day, like before the sun came up, with a headlamp. And he had a buddy that did it with him. And there was a peak on Mount Superior, up kind of near Snowbird, I guess. I'm not sure exactly where it's located. He would do this hike, and it was very narrow and steep. Literally, they're walking up a what can I call that? It's like a point, like a knife point, where the rocks come.
It's like the mountain ridge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's
it's a ridgeline hike.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's very steep on both sides. So, and they're not using any equipment. It's all just free. They're just walking with, no ropes or anything. It was very dangerous, but he did that every morning before work. That was his hike, and he was trying to beat his time, and loved the risk. He loved, it was like a thrill. It was one of those adrenaline junkie kind of things, I guess. And his son, whose name is Hartman Rector, jumps out of planes with a squirrel suit, and flies through like you can see it on YouTube. Look up Hartman Rector loves to fly.
Wow.
See what I'm talking about. It's insane, but it's in their blood, I guess. But so Dan did that. And one morning, like any other morning, he was with his buddy, and he just slipped. And he went, they said, over 350 feet to where he ended up stopping. Because it was so steep, you would just tumble,
Yeah.
And broke almost every bone in his body. So it was really sad, because he was so fit. He was so happy. He was such a good, cheerful person. It was just a loss.
Yeah.
And he had, a wife and 4 kids, and it was only 46, Yeah. I've outlived him by almost 20 years now. It's just,
wow.
It was
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Thank you.
So your relationship with him played into a little bit into your exit from the faith. I know we're sort of jumping ahead. So after you read that book, were you still in the church when Paul asked you to read that book about spiritual abuse?
Oh, that just happened like in the last 6 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, okay. That's recent.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about what started to lead you away? Because you had said your oldest brother left. That was a cautionary tale. And then
Dan happened.
And then Dan and Sunstone, everything, he wasn't excommunicated.
Right.
And so then what happened with your faith after that?
Well, I have a younger brother who had stepped away, but had been very quiet about it. And a younger sister. My baby sister had stepped away. And they had done it kind of undercover without telling my parents. My mom had Alzheimer's by now. So she didn't really know anything that was happening. She kept forgetting that Dan had died. And it was relive that over and over. She kept asking, "Where's Daniel?" And we would tell her, and she would just fall apart. Anyway, that's a whole other story. But so my younger brother had left, and he had pointed out to me the problematic things about the Book of Abraham. One day, we were packing up my parents' things in their house. They were moving, and there was all these pictures that my dad had of the papyri, and they had taken them off the wall. And I noticed that they hadn't been on the wall for a long time. And I said, why did you take these down, Dad? And John elbowed me. My brother John elbowed me and he said, don't go there. And I was like, why? Why can't I go there? And he goes, have you heard? Do you know about the whole problem with the Book of Abraham? And I said, no. What are we talking about? And he goes, well, I'll talk to you in a minute about it, when Dad's not around. So he took me aside, I don't know, a while later and said, Dad took them down because he found out from somebody that there's all this, that there's problems with the Book of Abraham, and that it doesn't say anything about Abraham, and that it's just a funerary text that they put in with all the mummies, and it's like nothing what he said it was. And I was stunned. I said, what? I said, it's still in the scriptures, that facsimile.
Mm-hmm.
So like, if it's not true, why wouldn't they have taken that out? He goes, well, your dad, our dad wants to think that there's going to be some more evidence that's going to come out later. But right now he feels embarrassed. So he took them off the wall. Anyway, so we talked about that. And I was like, John, are you going to church anymore? Because at this time he lived in Idaho and he was a professor at BYU, Idaho. And he was like, that's on the down low. He goes, I go because I have to, because if I don't go, I'll lose my whatever they call it, my
professorship, his job.
job.
Yeah.
So he said, so don't, we can't talk about that. And I was like, okay, but do you believe? And he said, no. And that kind of planted a seed, because my younger brother, John, is one of those intellectuals. He's super smart. He knows a lot of stuff. And he was just the type that would figure it out if it wasn't true. And I knew that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just want to show people what we're talking about, because my listeners, obviously, who've never been Mormon. So the Book of Abraham came about because there was a salesman passing through town, right? Stop me if I'm getting this wrong, because some of my Mormon brain cells have died, which I'm happy about.
Yeah.
But there were some people passing through town. They claimed that they had these Egyptian mummies and these what they called papyri, which is what you're seeing here on the screen. This sort of Egyptian-looking, hieroglyph.
Yeah.
And Joseph Smith said, "Oh my gosh, this is ancient scripture. Give it to me, and I will translate it." And it became the Book of Abraham, which talks a lot about the formation of the world. Or am I getting that right?
Yeah.
It's in the Pearl of Great Price, right?
Yeah.
Which is so the Mormon canon of scripture is the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, which were the revelations given to Joseph Smith while he was leading the church, and then the Pearl of Great Price, which contained, the translation, quote unquote, that Joseph made from these papyri that he bought from a traveling salesman, essentially. And so then it came out later. Now, back then, there was not a proliferation of Egyptologists around to say whether or not what Joseph Smith translated was a translation. And so I think he probably just believed that he was going to get away with that, And then later on, some Egyptologists did look at it and say, this is not a book of scripture. It has nothing to do with anything ancient scripture-wise. It is just instructions on how to conduct a funeral and
embalming of the body.
How to embalm. And it's so looking back at it now, like that Joseph Smith gave us this interpretation of what this was about.
Unreal.
Looking back on it now, it's very clear to see the jars that that they would put the organs in. It totally does look like an embalming type of a ceremony or whatever. So but when you believe Joseph Smith was a prophet, then that means everything that he taught was from God, whether or not it makes sense, right? So there's that thought-stopping technique. And then what year was it that this came about? Because I didn't even know about the Book of Abraham until after I left the church 2 years ago.
Well, that's just it. It's been out there for a long time. Well before the September 6th. I mean,
Wow.
this is something that the church has been aware of for quite a while. I don't know when the Rosetta Stone. See, I wish I came with all my, with documentation for everything. But once they were able to translate Egyptian, even the BYU Egyptologists had to say, oh, yeah, this isn't what Joseph said it was. It's not any of it. None of it is right. Not one word of it. And he referred back to, figure A, or figure 1 or 2 or whatever. So it's not like, and he put numbers, and he even filled in parts that were missing and drew what he thought it looked like. And it wasn't at all what it was supposed to be, because they have lots and lots of these. This is something that happened almost every time they buried someone. They would put one of these in the tomb or in the
in the sarcophagus. Yeah.
With mummy. And so it wasn't anything. I mean, they've got lots and lots of these in all kinds of museums. So they know what it was supposed to look like. And Joseph Smith drew it in, or he had an artist do it or something, and it's completely wrong.
So I'm just looking this up here because I was curious to know. So it says in 1966, fragments of the Joseph Smith papyri were rediscovered in the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. In 1967, 11 of those fragments were returned to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And critics concluded that Joseph Smith fabricated the Book of Abraham because the fragments did not contain any of the Book of Abraham's text. And then in 2014, University of Chicago Egyptologist Robert Rittner concluded that the Book of Abraham was, quote, an erroneous invention by Joseph Smith. And then the church officially revised its explanation in 2013.
Okay. So back in the 60s, they knew.
Yep.
Did you watch any of Robert Rittner with RFM?
I did not. There's so much to dig into, and I've only been out of it. I only started looking at truth claims in December of 2022.
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
And I resigned my membership in February of 2023.
Okay. Yeah. So
so I'm a baby in this space. There's a lot I still don't know.
There's a lot I don't know. So yeah, and I left in 2019. So yeah, those were really cool. Those interviews with RFM and Robert Rittner. He ended up passing away shortly after. He had cancer or something, and we knew that he wasn't going to live long, but he got all of this information out, and it was brilliant. And of course, all the BYU Egyptologists were furious because he basically said that I shouldn't say Egyptologists, the apologists who are claiming that there was another scroll somewhere that we don't have, or that, he wasn't actually translating, he was channeling, or they're playing around with words now because Joseph Smith said it was a translation.
Yeah, the church officially calls it an inspired translation.
So yeah, he's channeling it, right? Yeah. Which is BS. So anyway, so my brother planted that seed, but I didn't leave right away. I was in the throes of a divorce. And then right after my divorce, not right after, but the next 4 years, my ex-husband was battling cancer. So I was dealing with that. And I moved back into our home and took care of him. I mean, it was crazy stuff that was going on.
Yeah, I'm just going to highly recommend, and I'll put it in the show notes, that everyone go and watch your Mormon Stories interview, because you go so in depth into these circumstances and time in your life, and it's very emotional. Yeah. It's very beautiful. I use the word beautiful for things that are beautiful and terrible. So I don't mean it to be dismissive at all of how horrible and hard those experiences were for you.
Thank you.
I have a great deal of respect for you because I recognize the things that you've been through have been so incredibly difficult. And I don't know.
Thank you.
I admire you for that. So.
Thank you. Well, and I feel the same way about you, Megan. So
thanks.
Yeah, you've been through a lot too. So a whole bunch. So these things it was very, very emotional time. I wasn't thinking I need to look into the problems with the church, right? Just hanging on by my fingernails.
Right.
And doing whatever I could to get through it. And then after my husband passed away, I moved in. I call him my husband, even though we were divorced. He was my ex-husband, but I still was right there. So really, we were very involved. And then when he passed, I moved in with my sister who lived with my dad, and we took care of him together for the next year. And then he passed. And my mother had already passed before my ex-husband did. So then we had to move their whole house, everything in it. We had to sell everything. And that was another giant thing. And then I had to find a place to live. And so it was just a lot of upheaval in my life. But what I knew something was up. And I knew that it wasn't what I thought it was, that the church was not what I thought it was all my life. So when I moved into this little house that I'm in right now with my son, my youngest, I stopped going to church at that point. And he wanted to keep going, but he wanted to go to this old ward where his friends were. So he did for a short period of time he went. But then COVID happened, which was really timely for me because that was an excuse for me to not be in church and nobody's going to ask questions. Same with my son.
Right.
And then, once my bishop here found out that I wasn't attending our ward and I wasn't attending the old ward, once COVID kind of righted itself somewhat in 2020, he started coming over and wanting to talk to me and trying to find out why I wasn't going to church. And so
I just have to ask, was he single?
My bishop?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Just curious.
I have 11 kids. So what really did it though, what made me really pull back and have a full-on complete faith crisis. I always had questions, but then one day this friend of mine says, "Hey, will you watch this?" It was a podcast. She said, "Will you watch this and tell me what you think?" She goes, "I'm scared to watch it because I have a feeling it's got bad stuff in it." And I was like, "Okay, send it to me."
This reminds me of my mother-in-law, my former mother-in-law, who used to come over and she would bring us a basket of jars or cans or whatever. And she would say, this all has really bad preservatives and food dyes in it, so I'm not going to eat it anymore. So here, will you guys eat it? I'm like, why would you do that to me?
Trying to kill me?
Right?
Yeah.
Here, this is going to be really terrible. You watch it.
Yeah. She was like, I can't watch it because her boyfriend had given it to her to watch. He was already out and he was in still, and she was just scared to watch it. So I was like, sure, I'll watch it. So I did. And I think looking back, it was John DeLynn interviewing Carol Lynn Pearson about her book, Eternal Polygamy, the Ghost of Eternal Polygamy.
Yeah.
But I didn't know him. I didn't know who John DeLynn was at the time. I knew Carol Lynn Pearson. So I was like, oh, I like her. She's cool. I always liked her. So I'm listening to this and she's talking about Joseph Smith's polygamy. And she's talking about it very factually. She has documentation for it. And I'm like, hold on. Did I know Joseph Smith practiced polygamy? And then I had this spark of remembering when I was young, listening to my brothers and Paul and my dad talking about polygamy with Joseph Smith. And it all sort of like it was like deja vu. And I thought, wait a minute, that's right. Because I thought that it was just a bunch of controversial stuff. It wasn't really true. In fact, my dad had told me, don't worry about this, because I was all worried about it. And he said, Lila, just go read your Book of Mormon and stay going to church. Don't worry about this stuff.
Yeah, just read more, pray more, be more faithful, and everything will work itself out.
Yeah.
God will have the answers later.
It's all just, these are just stories from people's journals. We don't even know if it's true. And so I'm like, when Carolyn Pearson's talking about it, like she knows what she's talking about, as if this is documented and true, I was totally just triggered. And it's like when, the House of Cards and let's say you pull out the bottom card, eventually it all just goes
right,
explodes. So that's what happened. Like I pulled out that card of, wait a minute, if Joseph Smith practiced polygamy and he was doing what she was talking about was the young girls behind Emma's back before Emma even knew. And then I remembered I always hated Doctrine and Covenants 132. And I was like, so basically he was threatening her with her life if she didn't go along with this. He was basically saying God was going to destroy her if she didn't go along with it. That is coercion. That's manipulation. That's wrong. So all these things, just, it was like, if that's not true, then that's not true. Then that's not true. Then that's not true. And pretty much the whole thing just fell apart. And I'm talking within days, maybe 3 or 4 days, the whole thing came tumbling down. And I was in shambles. Like, what just happened?
So are you talking about Lucy Walker?
I'm talking about Fanny Alger, Lucy
Walker,
okay. All of them. Yeah. There's stories about, with him with the drawn sword, the angel with the drawn sword saying, if you don't do this, the angel's going to kill me. That's coercion. That is manipulation. And I knew that. Like, it was like, if that's my prophet, the founder of this whole thing, and he was doing that kind of stuff, I have to throw the whole thing out. Like, it all goes. And that's really what happened. Like, the whole thing was just broken glass on the floor. And I remember thinking, I could pick up a few shards and put them together and sort of do a makeshift belief, but it was so fragmented and so sharp and painful that I couldn't do it. I wanted to hang on to Jesus for a while. I wanted to hang on to God for a while. And then I started thinking, wait a minute, when my ex-husband was dying of cancer, my kids and I did 2 5-day fasts where we didn't eat food for 5 days. We drank water, but we didn't eat food for 5 days. And we were sure he had so many blessings, and every single one of them said he would be healed. Every one of them. I remember my father, giving him a blessing, saying he would be healed.
Wow.
He wasn't. And I remember thinking, what do I do with this?
Yeah.
How do I make sense out of this? How does this work? How does the priesthood work if they give him blessings and we're supposed to have faith, which we did? I mean, we had faith. And then it doesn't happen. And they're saying God is going to heal him, no questions asked. Like, it was just it was so many things. It was so many things. I was like, wait a minute, this whole thing is becoming thin. Like, I can't hold it anymore. It's falling through my fingers, and there's nothing to hold on to anymore. All of it. And I remember thinking, how will I move forward after everything I've built on this? I raised my kids in it. I have returned missionary sons. I made all the choices I made in my life. Everything, this was the foundation of everything that I did, right down to getting married when I did, to who I did. I thought that my patriarchal blessing was guiding me. I thought my prayers were guiding me. And then I realized, no, actually, you've made those choices. God never said a word. You put those thoughts in your head. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like that movie. Remember the movie Sixth Sense, I think it was?
Yeah.
Where there's the whole time you don't know that he's dead until the
Right.
end of the movie.
Oh,
And then,
sorry. Spoiler alert, everyone.
oh,
You're good. If they haven't seen it by now, they deserve to have it spoiled.
it's an old movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you don't know until the end that he was dead the whole time, and he just was imagining himself in all these situations. And then you watch it again and you're like, oh, he never really did talk to his wife.
Yeah.
They were sitting there at the table, but she never actually, like,
Yeah, they go back and they show you all of those scenes.
right.
And you realize, oh, they never did touch. She never answered him. You see
Yes.
it.
Yeah. You see it from a fresh pair of eyes now. That's what happened. I started looking at my whole life with a fresh pair of eyes and saying, okay, so I built this whole thing out of my own mind.
Yeah.
I assumed God was intervening when really he wasn't. He didn't change a thing. And when I saw right in front of me my ex-husband and all of that not come to fruition. I mean, of course, I always knew sometimes it's your time to die, but these blessings were not saying that.
Right.
These
And you were promised that if you would be faithful and you and your children fasted and prayed for 5 days, what is a more a greater manifestation of someone's faith than to go without essential nutrients for 5 days straight? And I've done long fasts like that before. I know what happens to your body when you do that. That's a sacrifice. That's a huge sacrifice. You're in pain.
Yeah, it's really I mean, my kids were so strong. They were so, and I thought, I remember thinking, did somebody cheat when we fasted?
Oh man.
Right? Oh, like it was our fault that he died. That is the mindset, because we didn't have enough faith. Who didn't have faith? Raise your hand. Because I had faith. Did you not have faith? Why did he die?
Man.
You know, so this is what they set up. They set up this ridiculous, impossible mindset.
Yeah.
And now they realize this. So now they come out with, do you have the faith not to be healed? That's the new one. That's the
that's a Bednar manipulation. He also isn't he also the temporary commandments guy?
Yes.
And he's also the don't use the word temple anymore. You know, he is setting the church up for when he's going to lead the church. He is setting it up to lead the way that he wants to lead. I think he's very calculated, and I think he is strategically planting these little seeds, biding his time until he's the one that leads the church, and then he can go back and say, "Look, 5 years ago, I was saying this 5 years ago."
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a huge manipulation.
Yeah. I mean, you can see it. He also was the one that was saying, no, when you got baptized, you agreed to serve a mission. There is no choice in the matter, right? You already agreed.
Right. He also said there are no gay members of the church.
Right.
Yeah, he is a piece of work. He is one of the most malignant narcissists I've ever seen publicly, being narcissistic in public, and it is a scary future for the members of the church who are going to be subject to that or make themselves subject to it.
I know. I agree. I felt that way about him for a while. He's scary. And Oaks is,
Oaks is no better.
So yeah, so that's basically, I mean, if I boil it down, that's kind of the process that I went through. And very quickly, I went from believing everything to believing nothing. And kind of having a weight, I call it was like 500 pounds came off my shoulder. that I was carrying around. It's the guilt and the shame and the pressure of doing all the things and then making sure that, you know, you've checked all the boxes and that you've repented for everything that you possibly can remember. And then you're also doing all these things every day, you know, and the list is ridiculously long, and burdensome. And then nobody's perfect. And so then you're like, am I going to make it? For years, for most of my life, I had already resigned myself to believe that I was not going to make it to the celestial kingdom to be with my family. And I just accepted that I wasn't going to make it and that I needed to be happy in a lower kingdom, you know, just make the best of it.
You know what? Your story and mine are almost exactly the same in this particular way, because it was absolutely Joseph Smith's manipulation that led me to complete. That was it. I was done. But I had already gotten to the point, like you're just saying right now, that I don't fit in Mormonism. I'm never going to be there. And maybe it's just okay if I'm, you know, I'm fine with the celestial kingdom. I'm fine with the terrestrial kingdom. You know, if it's better than this life, I'm fine with it. Right.
Right.
And I just believed the brethren were getting it wrong about the LGBTQ community. And I was like, well, maybe in 150 years, they'll come out and change it like they did with Black people and the priesthood and temple blessings. And so I had resigned myself that I didn't fit in Mormonism, that I was never going to make it to the celestial kingdom. I didn't have a man to take me to the celestial kingdom. My husband was not, he was a member, but he was not active.
Yeah. So you couldn't count on him to get you in.
No. And so I was like, and also after I got divorced, I started dating a little bit in the Mormon community. And I was like, this ain't it. I'm never going to find a person because they're all raised in this system.
Yes.
Where they believe that I'm lesser.
100%. 100%. I am with you on that.
And I was like, okay, so I guess that's just the end. And then for me, it was, I saw a symposium that Sandra Tanner was speaking at. And she said she was relating a story about having lunch with a church historian. And she said to this historian, how do you get around the fact that Joseph Smith was a predator? And it was like, when she said that word, bang, I had, you know, been through all of my therapy after being SA as a child and, you know, having all kinds of abusive situations throughout my life, recognizing the tactics of predatory people. And it was like, again, like, just like you, this light bulb went off. And all of a sudden, I saw Joseph Smith for who he was.
Yeah.
For someone who isolated his victims, manipulated them into believing that either he or they were going to suffer eternal consequences if they didn't do this thing that only benefited him.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. And so right. For me, it was the same thing. I went down a rabbit hole after seeing that interview, and for 3 days I did nothing but read and cry and read and cry and read and cry. And I even had to take a day off of work, and I called my boss and I was like, I have to go through this grieving process. And when I came out the other side, like you, I literally felt shame leave my body.
Yes.
And I thought, I am free for the very first time in my life to choose what I value.
Oh my gosh. Yes. I felt like I wanted to run to the top of the mountain, you know, like on Sound of Music when she does this
twirling.
I wanted to do that because it was like, I'm free. I'm finally free. And I felt it. It was like I said, 500-pound weight off my back. It was like, I get to choose. I get to choose.
Yeah.
I didn't even know what to do with that.
Yeah.
It was like the most amazing thought. I get to choose what I want to believe or not. I get to decide how to live the rest of my life. I don't have to follow any of these people's rules. I don't have to do the checklist. Oh my gosh. It was just so freeing and so, oh man, empowering.
Yes.
And I found myself standing up with more like determination. I felt more powerful when I walk into any circumstance, I was like, I got this. It wasn't like I thought I was better. No, it was just, I'm even with you now. I am on the same level as everyone else on the planet. None of us know what's really going to happen. We're all just, we're just shooting from the hip, doing our best. And I'm a good person. You're a good person. There's no, oh, it's too bad you're not a member. We need to get you baptized. You would make a really good member. Like, none of that.
Yeah. No looking at people through the lens of, oh, it's too bad they don't know the truth.
Yes. I have this truth that I really should share with you.
Yeah.
I was blessed to be born into the truth. There is, at least for me, if I'm really honest with myself, and it's hard to say this, but if I'm really honest with myself, I at times felt like I had more light and knowledge than the next guy that wasn't a member.
Yeah.
Even if they were brilliant, they didn't have all the truth that I had.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, did I ever learn that I didn't have anything? I had nothing. Nothing. Yeah. And that's very humbling, and yet it was empowering somehow. I don't know how that works.
Yeah, so there were two things for me too that are really similar to what you're saying, and one was like we talked about the freedom of being able to choose what you value. The other was being able to love all of the parts of myself instead of banishing parts of myself that were unacceptable in Mormonism.
Yes.
And the other beautiful thing was, like you're saying, being able to look at a human being and love and respect them for exactly who they are, for their experiences, for their culture, without looking down on it as if it's less than something that I know.
Yeah.
And coming to, yes, like you're saying, the humbling realization that not only did you not know more than someone else or better than someone else, but you actually didn't have anything at all. And that probably the reverse was true, that people were looking at you going like, you're so stupid. I can't believe. And I actually had my partner's uncle, when I told them that I was officially resigning, I sent my papers in to be removed from the records of the church. And he looked at me and he said, Megan, I always considered you to be a really intelligent person. How is it they could have fallen for such a big bunch of bullshit?
Exactly.
And I was like, people have looked at me like that for my entire life, and I had no idea.
You didn't know. Yeah. You didn't know.
Yeah.
Same thing. I mean, yeah. My boyfriend, who was never a member, said the same thing. He said, you're too smart to have gotten sucked into that. What? And I said, I was born into it. It's a little different. I mean, even
indoctrination and brainwashing.
Yeah. You get, and if that's all you know, and your parents are telling you this is the truth.
Yeah.
It's really hard to see it for what it really is for a long time. Like I'm kind of shocked myself that it took me as long as it did, because I had questions all along, but I just wouldn't go there with the question. The one question I wouldn't ask is, what if it's all not true? Like, what if it's fake? I couldn't ask that question. It was, this part doesn't make sense to me. This part I don't like. I'm going to have a talk with the Heavenly Father someday.
Right.
I don't like how that leader did that. But it was never, is the whole thing just false? And when I finally had to take a look at that, that's when it's like all my cognitive dissonance or my reasoning skills, it's like they all sort of rose to the surface and said, yeah, we're going to take this down. We're going to dismantle this whole thing right now for you, because it's all been there all along. I just wouldn't look at it.
Yeah. See, I did ask myself that question. What if it's all false? What if none of this is true? What if we're all wrong? And I would gaslight myself, and I would say, but my parents and my grandparents and my like 7 generations back, how could they all be wrong? And I'm the only one that's right, because as of that time, I had one cousin on my mom's side who had left the church when she was 18.
Wow.
And again, we saw it as a cautionary tale. We looked at her life and we were like, don't want that. When in reality, she had a beautiful life. She had moved to the she was very happy. And I've talked to her since I left. She moved to the Pacific Northwest. She became a massage therapist. She had a lovely relationship with the man, and that relationship ended, and we all went, oh, see, you know?
Find any little validation, right?
Yeah, and it was like I remember my grandmother who I dearly, dearly loved died in 2013, and we all were together for the funeral, and she was the only one who was out. And
she was out of the cousin was out. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the oldest cousin. She was the only one that was out. And I just remember that feeling of like we would be friendly with her, but we sort of knew like she's not going to be with us forever, and that's sad. It was like we kept our distance from her. I purposely did not try to get to know her because exactly. Yeah. And so I just looked at the entirety of my family and I was like, who am I to be the only one in 100 years to question this? In 150 years, right? To question this. Like,
because usually there's more. You only had that one cousin. Usually
on my mom's side. Now my dad's side, his mom was a convert to the church. He joined when he was like 12 or 13 or so. And so there were a lot of my dad's relatives who never were Mormon, right? But we always saw that as like, okay, well, his mom led them to the truth and they had the truth, and all those other family members will find out later. So the ones who weren't in the church, it was like, well, we'll do their work for them after they die.
Of course.
And my dad used to refer to himself as the only white sheep in an all black sheep family. And so that's the way we saw it, was that he and his siblings were the ones who had found the truth. Since then, some of my cousins on my dad's side have left the church. And I think it's really interesting, the idea of quiet quitting, because a lot of us were vocal about leaving the church. I've since then observed people who have just silently stepped away. And I love that approach, because then there's no argument about it. There's no shame and judgment. There's no trying to pull you back in. Right. It's just, we don't talk about it. And I think that's probably, it's a wise approach in some respects.
Yeah. That's what my two siblings, John and Lucy, both did. The quiet fade out is what they called it.
Yeah.
They just kind of backed out, and they weren't living here in Utah anymore. So we couldn't really keep track. Like, we didn't know if they were going to church or not.
Yeah.
I kind of wondered, because my youngest sister would put stuff on her Facebook with, like, she'd be holding a glass of wine with her friends. And I'd be like, garments,
Yeah.
And then finally, like, I asked her straight up. I said, have you left the church? And she goes, I just don't go anymore. And I kind of think it's dumb to think that you have to have a handshake to get into heaven. Like, you have to know the special handshake.
Yeah.
So I was like, yeah, I know, that's kind of dumb, isn't it? So I had these little, just, I don't know, teasers, I guess, in the back of my head. Like I said, I just never, and you asked the question to yourself, but then you would gaslight yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So
yeah.
Myself.
So I feel like all of the things that we've been talking about, starting with your brother's experience with Sunstone and all of that, from that all the way up until when you finally did step away, I feel like all of that can be classified as spiritual abuse. And I would love for you to kind of expand on that idea, because a lot of people, that's a foreign idea. They don't really necessarily understand what that means.
Well, it was to me too. I was like, spiritual abuse, how do you even do that? But now I kind of I've done some research on it, and I am, maybe you're building up to this. I'm kind of, I know you have a book, which I have. I love that you have a book. What's the title of your book again?
It's called I Walked Through Fire to Get Here.
Okay. And do you have it on Audible?
No, because I started to make the audiobook. I self-published as well, and I was going to do my own audiobook. In fact, that's sort of how the podcast was born. I started to record it, and I realized I wrote a lot of that book while I was still healing from complex PTSD, and I still was very close to my trauma, and it was cringy for me to read it. And so I decided instead what I'm going to do is at the end of this month, actually, which is just a few days away, I'm going to pull it from publication and rewrite it, revise it with this new lens, and republish it. So
I love that. Great idea, because you've probably grown and in many ways that
I'm a million miles away from where I was when I wrote the majority of that book. The only part of it that's recent is that the Mormon chapter, and this is actually what led me out of the church. The Mormon chapter I had already written, but it was very apologetic. And I asked my partner Samuel to read it because he's never been Mormon. And I said, I just want to make sure that I've said everything that needs to be said here. I feel like maybe I'm missing something. And he was infuriated after he read it. He was like, you can't publish this. You're apologizing for this really harmful, horrible organization. And I was still at the point then where I was like, well, I guess I'm just not getting into heaven, and that's okay with me, right?
yeah.
So when he said that, it was really like the November 2015 policy, Natasha Helfer being excommunicated for teaching that masturbation is a normative human practice. That was my first introduction to who John DeLynn was. I had no idea who he was before that. And even until I walked in the studio, I had no idea how big Mormon Stories was or what it was or anything. So it was those sort of things building up. So when I was going to revise that chapter, I said, okay, so I believe that they got it wrong in 1978 about Black people in the priesthood. I think they're getting it wrong about the LGBTQ community now. So I want to go back and find out when they stopped doing that, because I know from my time teaching gospel doctrine, I knew that Joseph Smith had ordained a couple of Black people to the priesthood, right? And so I was like, maybe Brigham Young just got it wrong and he's the villain in the story. And, let me start to try to pick that apart. And when I started doing that digging, I came across Shannon Caldwell Montez's thesis called The Secret Mormon Meetings of 1922.
Right.
Where B.H. Roberts, the church historian, presented 130 pages of problems with the Book of Mormon. So then I went to go reading.
Mission somewhere for a while.
And what?
They banished him. They pretty much just.
Yeah, they basically ignored what he had to say, stood up and bore their testimony, and then sent him on a mission.
Yeah.
Which is the church's pattern for getting rid of people, right? And so from there, I went to reading No Man Knows My History. And I grew up, or I spent at least my middle school and high school years in New England. And so a lot of what was being talked about by Fawn Brody in that book, I was resonating with, because I was like, absolutely, there are these mounds and there are these stone fences everywhere. And I can understand how the mound builder myths came about. And when I found out about A View of the Hebrews having a really similar storyline, I was like, oh no, are you serious? Really? And so I was in the process of trying to get a hold of a copy of A View of the Hebrews, because I wanted to know for myself. I didn't want to take anybody else's word for it. I was done doing that.
Yeah.
And so I was in the process of trying to find that when I came across Sandra Tanner's interview.
Okay.
And so I had started that process at the end of December in 2022. And by the end of January, was when I read the Secret Mormon Meetings of 1922. And then it was just the beginning of February when I found that interview by Sandra Tanner. And it was just a few days. I want to say it was 3 days of just completely deconstructing everything. And then I remember on February 14th, on Valentine's Day, I was getting ready to head into the grocery store to buy some, steak and lobster to make for Valentine's dinner. And I was listening to a Mormon Stories episode where they were talking about a tithing lawsuit. And I was like, that's an interesting story. I want my money back. I've been defrauded. In fact, I also want to be compensated for all of the hours that I worked for the church for free. But they were saying if you wanted to be a part of that lawsuit, you had to have resigned your membership. And I was like, that's it. I'm out.
I'm out.
I printed the paper. I had it notarized and signed, and I sent it off that day. So February 14th is also the day in 2017 that I ended my marriage. So that's my
happy Valentine's Day.
Yeah. So that's my Independence Day. And I forget why I even started telling this story. So
I don't know.
Oh, you asked me about my book, so I'm going to revise it and republish it. That's all.
Good. I want to know when you do that, because I would like to have a copy of that.
Yeah.
I will buy it. Yeah. So what were you having?
So we started saying that we could classify everything that you and I have been through as spiritual abuse. And I was asking you to sort of define that for us if you can, and then talk about your book.
Okay. So when I first heard that from Paul, I went to Chat GPT and I said, what is spiritual abuse? And this is what came up. I don't know. Can I share?
Yeah.
So it says, spiritual abuse is a form of psychological and emotional abuse that occurs within a religious or spiritual context. It involves the misuse of spiritual authority or power to control, manipulate, or exploit others. Religious leaders can carry out this type of abuse. Members of a spiritual community, or even within intimate relationships where one partner uses spiritual beliefs to dominate the other. Key characteristics of this abuse, I won't read all of this, but I'll just read the main bullet points. Number 1, manipulation and control. Number 2, exploitation. 3, shaming and guilt. 4, isolation. 5, undermining personal agency. 6, spiritual disillusionment. And you might think, well, the church doesn't do those. But if you if you look at all of the little descriptions, they actually do these things. I didn't mean to do that actual size. Okay, so the impact on victims. Victims of spiritual abuse often suffer from long-lasting emotional and psychological harm, including anxiety, depression, loss of faith, difficulty trusting others. The abuse can also lead to feelings of alienation, spiritual confusion, and a profound sense of betrayal. And then it goes into prevention and healing. Then it talks a little more about how narcissistic abuse is part of this. And the way that it involves narcissism is that the narcissistic control, which is the leaders of the church, manipulate your spiritual beliefs. They gaslight and use spiritual distortion. I don't like using that word.
I don't either, because of thank you, Jody Hildebrand.
Thanks, Jody. Exploitation of vulnerabilities, isolation and control, inflicting guilt and shame. We know they do that.
Yeah.
Running personal spirituality. So basically, and using spirituality to justify abuse.
Yeah. And I just want to point out real quick while we're talking about narcissistic abuse, the two biggest markers of people with narcissistic traits is that they cannot or they will not accept responsibility for their behavior.
Right.
And they lack empathy. So they're not able to understand how their actions and behaviors impact other people.
I agree 100%. So they're not even seeing that what they're doing is harmful.
Exactly. So, and we know, Dallin H. Oaks, thank you for clarifying this for us, that we neither give nor seek apologies. That's 100%. They will not accept responsibility for what they're doing. And we've seen this pattern of policies that have come out that have harmful effects on huge groups of people, and the church doesn't care. No. They're like, well, sorry, talk to God. We're the prophets.
You're a problem, not ours.
Right.
You need to deal with that. And they also say it is wrong to criticize the leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true. So you have no voice, you have no way to speak out and say, hey, this is abusive, because if you do, they can just get rid of you.
Right. And the way that I like to help people think about this on a level that they can relate to better is, if you were to think of the church as your primary partner, if the church was your spouse or your boyfriend or your whatever, your primary relationship, and they did something wrong, your partner does something wrong, and you call them out on it, you say, hey, that was really harmful. And they said to you, well, I'm not going to apologize. I don't apologize. Yeah. Would you stay in that relationship?
Shouldn't. No? You wouldn't.
Exactly. And so what was the other example you gave? It was the other thing that Dallin Oaks said.
The criticize.
Oh, even if the criticism is true, right? So if you go to your spouse and you say, hey, you were really disrespectful to me, and I don't appreciate that. I deserve to be treated with kindness and respect.
Yeah.
And your partner said to you, you're not allowed to criticize me, even if it's true. Would you stay in that relationship? No. Absolutely not.
No, not if you're not, unless you are at a point in your where they have completely hijacked your self-esteem and your love of who you are. And if they can do that, then you will put up with that abuse if they have broken your spirit to that point.
Right. And that's the entire tactic behind manipulation and control, is for them to devalue you,
right,
so that you do subjugate your personal power to the other person, because you believe the lie that you're not good enough, you're not strong enough, and you don't have the power to fight back or to have a voice or to speak up for yourself.
Right. And they're really good at doing that. They're really good at devaluing us. They teach you from the day you're born that you are broken, that you need a savior, that your own thoughts are not, well, they tell you that you're human, which is below what God thinks, how God thinks. And so you always need to look to a higher power. Always. Never trust your gut, because your gut is just human, and you're full of faults and frailties. So you need to look to a higher power. And they even say God speaks through us, so we can take the place of your higher power.
Exactly. They teach you that you're broken, and that the only way to fix you is to look to them as the solution.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to point out too, this is not unique to Mormonism. There are many religions that do this same pattern, these same thought patterns, the idea of original sin in the Catholic Church, etc. So I believe that religions are on a spectrum, and even different congregations are on a spectrum of healthy to unhealthy, right? And I would say the Mormon Church is on the extreme side of unhealthy. And there are lots of other churches that fall on the unhealthy side of the spectrum. And I'm just saying that to validate, because I do have a lot of watchers, listeners who are of other faiths, but they will come back after an episode and say, oh my gosh, it was the same way in my church, and I didn't see it.
Yeah. No, I think probably I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I would say the majority of religions, Christian religions or not, majority of religions have some element of narcissistic control involved, because they rise to the top. Yeah. The narcissists rise to the top because they know how to manipulate. That's what they do 24/7. And so they can find their way into, like they do in business and everything else. They're in the power positions.
Right.
So it's almost impossible to not have a narcissist in charge of a religion.
Yep.
And then as soon as that happens, which is usually pretty early in the game, even if the founder, let's say the founder wasn't, let's just say for, I don't know, some amazing person who just wants to have a good group of people that get together and worship God together. eventually the narcissists in the group, which there always are because they're everywhere, will find a way into the upper echelons of that power system, and they will take control. So it doesn't matter what, you're going to end up in one. I mean, I would say the majority. I don't think every single religion is like that, but I would say most of them. It's just the way, it's like companies, most companies that are successful are run by narcissists.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, if you are a member of another religion that the same dynamic is going on, I'm not surprised. I do think that Mormonism has done a really good job of capitalizing on the power system that they have created, and they've gotten money. They've put so much guilt on the membership that if they're not paying their tithing, they're robbing God, and that God's giving them everything. All he asks for is 10%. And then they've just stockpiled that until they have billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that they can now live on and give themselves beautiful homes and cars and all the things they need. And then they can extract that money from their loyal followers who are really just trying to do what's right. Most of the people, members in the church, are just good, honest, loving, decent folk. Now, of course, there are those that are mixed into the group that are power hungry and that will get into bishoprics or stake presidencies or whatever and manipulate their wards. We call them wards, their congregations. But for the most part, I think the people are really decent, good people who are caught in this web. And that's probably true with every religion out there. Mostly good people, but the people at the top are often corrupt. And that's a frightening, frightening thing. That's why I have chosen at this stage of my life to completely step away from any type of religious affiliation. I know that some people really like having the social and the community of a religion and going on Sunday and meeting with their friends and, worshiping together. But for me, it left such a bad taste in my mouth when I realized the level of deceit. I felt completely shattered. My truth, my faith, my trust was completely shattered. And it's really hard for me now to even imagine ever going back and gracing the doors of a chapel. I've gone a few times to support family when they've had like baptisms or someone speaking or, a homecoming for a missionary or something like that. But as far as being a member, I also had my records removed. I did what Megan did, and I had my records removed. So I'm no longer a member. They used to hound me and try to get me to come to church, but they don't do that anymore. I made it pretty clear I'm not ever going back. So yeah, it pretty much, I think, damaged me for good. Although I now feel so happy and so full of life and so empowered to move forward. So what we were going to talk about, and I'll just quickly say, I'm writing a book. I'm not doing as much of the writing as I have in other books that I've done, but this book is mostly about spiritual abuse and about stories, personal stories that people have had with spiritual abuse. Like if you've been a member of the Mormon Church and you've left, or any other high demand fundamentalist religion and you've left, you probably have a spiritual abuse story or 2 or 10 that you could send me. So I would love to have your stories. I'm going to be compiling, I am compiling them as we speak, but I could take some more and I could do a volume 2. If I get too many, we'll just do volume 2 or 3 or 4. So I would love to have your story. We don't have to use your name. You can stay anonymous. A lot of them have aliases in my book so far. So if you want to be a part of that, send me your story. I'll give you my email address. She can put it in the show notes, but it's Lila, Lila, R for Rector, T for Tueller. So Lila RT Designs with an S at yahoo.com. You can just send me your story and say, hey, I saw you on Megan Connor's podcast and I would like to share my story. And then just give it to me. If it could be like, try to keep it under 2 pages, typewritten, single spaced or 1.5 spaced. I just don't want, I want to be able to include everyone, as many people as I can. So I don't want super long documents, but if you can summarize your story into a couple of pages, that's perfect. I want to know what's happened to you. What happened to you in the church or in any church?
So grateful that you're writing this book, because I think that spiritual abuse is a uninvestigated trauma, or underinvestigated, I should say. And I remember a few years ago, maybe it was 3 years ago or so, that Oprah came out with a book called What Happened to You? And it was stories of trauma, a collection of stories. And I think this is so important. And it's the reason that I wrote my book, is because I wanted other survivors to know that they weren't alone.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people experience spiritual abuse, but they don't have the vocabulary to describe it or to understand it. And I think that this collection of stories, or these collections, hopefully it'll be, several editions. I think people learn the best about their own circumstances by observing other people's circumstances and finding things that resonate with them. And that was, your Mormon Stories interview was a big part of that for me too. While I was going through my deconstruction, I was like, here's somebody whose story is really similar to mine. Yeah. I've always loved that format that John has put out there, so that people know they're not alone. And I think this is going to be really important for not just Mormons, but for people of all faiths who've experienced this on some level.
I think so. I hope so. I do think that what John has done, I mean, look, it's still going, and it's been many years. 2005, I think he started.
Yeah, it's been 20 years.
Yeah, 20 years. People have, this is continuing to happen. It's not over. It keeps happening. And there's new people coming in saying, this just happened to me,
Right.
And that is helping everyone get through it. Like you said, you resonate with what other people are saying, and helps you process what's happened to you. So I have gotten quite a few stories, quite a few. I'm really happy about how many I've gotten, and they're pretty diverse so far. Like, there is the underlying common theme of abuse, but the way that it manifested for each person is a little bit different. So we have LGBTQ people that have their experience. We have people of color and their experience, and Native Americans, their experience. We have women, we have men, where their shaming started when they were young boys, and women about body shaming, about virtue signaling, and all those things that we just sort of allowed because it was just in the water we were drinking as members. It was the lesson on Sunday. We admired our teachers. Our friends were all there with us. We were accepting, at least in, I was in Utah, I was in California, I was in Florida, Virginia. So I've lived in a few different states with, and it's kind of the same everywhere. Like, you're there with your Mormon peers, and you're just sucking it all in as if it's true, with no critical thinking. Like, I had never used any critical thinking. I might have thought, I don't like this. This makes me uncomfortable, but it was never, that's wrong.
Right.
And I'm not doing it. Like, that didn't happen. I always internalized it was my problem. I needed to get over it. So yeah, I think we all have stories like this because it was just part of what we were taught from the beginning.
Yeah.
And once you peel it back and you see what what was actually happening when they were telling us these things, telling us that we would be a licked cupcake, telling us that we're a chewed up piece of gum.
Right.
No one's going to want you.
Right.
That was, what if you'd already been abused? What if you had already had, right?
That was me. Yeah.
Trauma. Now you're just, okay, I guess I'm nothing. I'm a wasted, licked cupcake nobody's going to want.
Yeah. Yeah. That was really hard for me because, my abuse happened between the ages of 7 and 11. My initial abuse. And so I got programmed. I got brainwashed in two ways. I was being brainwashed at church, and I was also being brainwashed by my abuser to believe that this was my whole purpose in life, that this is what all little girls were good for, that I had no value beyond my sexuality, and also that I was not allowed to say no. And so then later in life, when I was a teenager and I would be with a boy on a date, I would just freeze. I'd completely freeze. And I didn't have the ability to say no. I could not speak up for myself. I could not stop. Even though in my mind I was screaming, no, 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 I could never say it out loud. And, luckily I was with some boys who were kind and respectful and who didn't take advantage of that. But then I was with some who did take advantage of that.
Yeah.
And may not have even really known that they were taking advantage of it, because back then there was less communication about consent. And it was more like, well, if she doesn't say no, then I can continue. Right.
Uh-huh.
So there was so much inner turmoil and conflict for me about that, because I wanted so badly to live the standards of the church. And I even remember writing in my journal at one point, I was getting ready to go do baptisms for the dead in the temple. And, I was anticipating my bishop's interview and going like, what do I say? I know that I'm not clean.
Yeah.
And I remember writing in my journal, you don't enjoy this, so why do you keep letting people do it? So I had no framework of understanding what that was about. It's like, I guess I just am broken and I can't be good, So hearing the chewed up gum and the licked cupcake thing, I was like, yeah, that's me. I'm broken. I'm devastated. And I remember, unfortunately, my mom saying to me, when I got into my later teenage years, that no worthy priesthood holder is going to want you. And I think that's a big part of the reason why I didn't even try to marry somebody in the church, because I believed that about myself.
Hard that your mother would say that to you.
Yeah. She just was an unhealed, emotionally immature person. And she didn't know the harm that she was doing to me. She was just repeating what she had been conditioned to learn and understand.
Yeah.
So
definitely. I know. Well, and these are the kind of things that I want to know about. I want to have these in my book. It's a little bit triggering, to be quite honest, to read these. I'm like, oh, holy crap. I don't know how to spin this. I'm just laying it out and just saying, this is the raw truth.
Yeah.
Some of them are very explicit. Some of them are using foul language, but it's like, do I edit that? I don't think I should. I think it needs to be the real story, the way they said it.
Yeah.
And then, I can do a disclaimer if I have to about, hey, I'm sorry if this triggers. I mean, I probably have to do trigger warnings.
Yeah, sure. I think that's helpful and important. I remember when I was publishing my book, and one of my mom's relatives was thinking about reading it, and she said, well, is it uplifting? And I said,
well,
is it uplifting?
Why is
No.
that a criterion? Yeah.
No, it's not uplifting. It's the true story of exactly what happened to me.
Yeah. You want to hear the truth or not? Right?
It's the hard, messy, horrible work that it takes to climb out of a hole. So no, it's not uplifting. The truth is not uplifting.
No.
And I think that was her contention, is like, there's one truth. There's one great truth, and it's beautiful. And anything that's outside of that must not be the truth. And I was like, nope, sorry, that's not the case. You have to look at the hard, horrible, disgusting things. I think it's so important to leave it raw and to leave it real because people need to know.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. And I've asked a few people, I'm like, is this going to affect like negatively, or is it going to come across as just this big downer? So I did ask people if they wanted to include, and so I'm going to ask your viewership as well, if they want to take part in this, to include a little, maybe a paragraph or two about where you are now and how you've healed or how you've been able to reframe what's happened, and try to do, a little bit of a positive viewpoint.
Yeah. Yeah.
And afterwards, I want you to say everything.
Yeah.
But then also, if you have something else to say, that's good. That's positive.
Yeah. And that was a big, important thing for me too, was not just to let survivors know that they weren't alone, but also to let them know that it was possible to heal and move on and have a beautiful life. Because what I saw when I started therapy, especially in my group, I did an intensive outpatient therapy group, and it was mostly online. And I saw the other women in this group, and they weren't getting better. And they were repeating the same patterns, and they would sometimes disappear from group for 2 or 3 months and come back and say, I had a backslide and I went back in the hole again. And I was like, I wasn't seeing examples of women who climbed out of the hole and never went back in.
Yeah.
And so I wanted people to know that that was possible,
Thank you for doing that, because I don't want it to be, well, everything's gone to hell and we aren't, we're just going to be down in the dumps forever.
Yeah.
Because that hasn't been my experience either. I've been able to come on out on the other side of it and look back on it and say, yeah, that was rough. But now I'm starting fresh. Like, this is brand new life. No, I'm not young anymore. No, I can't rewrite my past. But moving forward from here, I am very determined to be happy and healthy and balanced and free, and look at everything out of a new lens. And I just want everyone to know that there is a brighter side to everything, all of it. It can all be. I just finished watching Michelle Stone on Mormon Stories. Did you happen to watch?
I'm about 2/3 of the way through.
You've gotten a taste of it.
Yeah.
What I'm seeing there, bless her heart, I think she's a really sweet lady.
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing is that she has gone through really triggering, awful things. And then she has reframed it in a way that I don't know that it's really healed. I feel like she just chooses to look at it from a completely different perspective that makes it okay.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, no, this was wrong.
Yeah.
And because it was wrong, I'm no longer going to accept that. I am now doing this with my life. She's staying in this toxic environment.
Yeah.
And trying to reframe it as it's okay to be in a toxic environment. And I think that as being an option.
Yeah. For me, it wasn't. For me, it wasn't either. And I have a lot of compassion for her and for anyone else who's in that same position, because I know she's not alone. I know there are lots of women in the church who continue to reframe their problematic experiences, and I don't blame them, because the alternative is going through a really scary, hard, horrible experience in which you could lose everything.
Yeah.
And I think some people don't understand well enough that the faith crisis forces you to confront not only all of your existential fears, the fear of death, the fear of meaninglessness, the fear of isolation, and the fear of freedom.
Yeah.
But it also forces you to confront the fact that you might lose everything. I was fortunate in that I was already estranged from my parents. We already have a limited contact relationship. I was already divorced. I wasn't going to lose my primary relationship. In fact, at the time, I was like, oh, this is going to make my relationship better because, you know, he said that if I ever went back to Mormonism, that would be it, you know.
Yeah.
And that has its own problems of itself. But most of my children were already out before I was. I will say it was like my oldest daughter and my youngest daughter were still in, and the 4 in the middle were on their various stages of out. And I actually didn't know how nuanced my oldest daughter already was at this point because we hadn't really discussed it. We had talked in little snippets about it, but we were being very careful not to trigger each other, you know.
I get it.
And so I didn't have to face a lot of the same really consequential decisions that a lot of people do when they go through their faith crisis. Not only that, but I don't live in Utah or Idaho or Arizona. And the church is, you know, has a presence here in Texas, but my livelihood doesn't depend on it.
Yes.
You know, so I came from a place of extreme privilege of being able to just walk away.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. I think I did too. In many ways, I had that privilege. I had already my divorce. Well, I divorced before he got sick and died. Right. So I didn't have a husband anymore. My parents had both passed. So I didn't have them saying, not another casualty in our family.
Yeah.
You know, and same thing. I happened to move just at the right moment that I didn't have to start going to church. So my ward had already said goodbye to me prior to my faith crisis. So they didn't see me go through it, you know? So in a lot of ways I was privileged too. And I see that as a benefit. I was kind of ready to take on a new change, you know, with my life.
Yeah.
But I think, would I have done the same thing? Like I did what you did, and I had my records removed, right? So would I have done that 20 years before if I found out all the things that I found out with all my kids in the home and my parents alive and my husband being married to him, who's very TBM? How would I have managed that?
Yeah.
I think it happened when I was able to do it. So I get it. I get what you're saying. It's hard for me to imagine staying, but I guess that's because I had a privileged exit. So maybe I need to think about that some more and be fair to Michelle.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also, you know, I thought about the possibility of doing sort of a recap of my feelings about her interview because it raised a lot of things that I would like to talk about. But I don't like the idea of talking about her and not talking to her.
Yeah.
Because that I know that is a sticking point for her, number one. And number two, I've had that done to me my entire life, where everybody's talking about Megan and nobody is talking to her.
Yeah. So you don't do that.
Yeah. I would love to have her on my show. I would, but I think what I want to do is just write her an email and just tell her how much I appreciate her vulnerability and honesty, and just to be a resource for comfort if she needs it. Because I can imagine that she is a polarizing person in her religious community.
Yeah.
And she probably feels pretty isolated, even though she's got a huge following on her channel, right? So she can go there for validation. But that almost makes it higher stakes for her, because if she now changes her position in any way, she loses that too.
That's right. She loses that. I wonder what happens if she decides to leave the church. She doesn't want to. She won't. She's way too, she loves the church too much. She loves something about it.
Yeah, I think what I've noticed so far in her interview is that she does love the church. She wants the church to be true. And it's almost like the church is the comfort blanket for her. It's not necessarily the fact that her husband's in or the fact that her children are in. It's the church. She just loves the church.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Anyway, I don't want to speak for her, but I am going to write to her.
I like that. I think you should. That's great.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't even know why I was referencing that, except, I know. It was the idea of reframing things to make it work, to make the church work for you.
Yeah.
And you know what? If I'm honest, I probably did that most of my life.
Yeah.
I just found a way, like you said, gaslighted myself into believing that it was okay because I'm going to find out why later in the next life. That's another, pie in the sky thing where they're like, anything that doesn't work out for you that you don't understand, don't worry, because in the next life, it's all going to make sense.
Right. You'll get all your answers in the next life. And that
they never have to produce that.
Yeah.
They can just say that and they're good.
Yep. And there's no way to recoup your investment if they're wrong.
No.
And they know that.
Exactly. There's no accountability for them on their side. Yeah. It's like the perfect answer for all the problems is to just say it's all going to work out in the next life. You just have to have faith. Don't worry about those things. That's the story of my life. So I would do that to myself. I'll find out one day and it'll make sense. And I'll talk to Jesus and he'll make sense of it, Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing that I reclaimed after leaving the church was the idea of what if this is all I get? What if this is all the time that I have? And I get to decide what I'm going to do with it and how I'm going to prioritize. And now my life is so much more meaningful because I'm savoring all of these things that I previously would have just said, oh, that's a happy memory. And the next life is going to be so much better. Like there was always this thought of like, it's going to be so much better after I die, that this life is like, of course it matters, but it's not like,
it's not
the end goal. It's not, I don't know how to really say it except to say that now I savor every moment that I get to spend with the people that I love. And now what I prioritize more than anything else is that, period. Like that's the only thing that really matters to me now is like, am I working towards spending time with the people that I love and care about and prioritizing that above anything else?
Yeah. Yeah, because everything else, there's not a U-Haul following you to the cemetery, right? So it's all meaningless, but you can take your relationships. And so and life is so short. Like, I don't know about you, but the older I get, the faster time goes. I can look back and say the last 10 years are a blink. Even though some parts of it were really long, overall, it's just over. It's just gone. Those years are gone. And my grandkids are grown 10 years more than they were 10 years. I'm just blown away by it. And I know, time is like every second, you don't get that second back. Every second that passes, you don't get it back. And it's so tenuous and scary when you look at it that way. We have to appreciate every minute.
Yeah.
We can't be living in the next life while we're here. It's just, I spent my whole life thinking about the next life.
Yep.
So whole new perspective on that.
Yeah. So there's a guy, Leon, I'm going to get his last name wrong. He was famous for the song, The Werewolves of London. And it was a little bit of a one hit wonder. And he died very young of cancer. And while he was, after he was diagnosed, he was in an interview and they asked him, what are you doing with the time that you have left? And he said, I'm going to enjoy every sandwich.
That's cute.
And I love that idea because it's like, like I was saying, of course, I'm going to savor this time with my kids, with the people I care about. But I'm also going to enjoy the beauty of the sunlight coming through the window and these beautiful flowers behind me and my silly dogs and waking up to birds singing in the morning and just notice every single thing and be grateful for it, for every moment.
It's too bad we couldn't do that as well before, because I really think that I've had that has been a new emergence in my life, is the appreciation for all the little things.
Yeah.
The flowers, the smells, everything.
Yeah. Well, you're a beautiful person. You have a beautiful story. And I'm so grateful that you're working on this book. I think it is such a beautiful way to contribute to humanity and to improve the quality of ordinary people's lives, which I think is the highest thing that anybody can do. So I love that.
And I thank you. And the same goes for you, Megan. You're making a difference with everything you're doing. You're making a huge difference. So keep doing it.
Thank you.
But I do think that there is something to a life where you've suffered, and then you're able to pass on some little nuggets of wisdom that you learned from that, so that someone else either won't have to suffer the way you did, or if they did, they learn something from it that maybe they wouldn't have. You're being the voice of trial, pain, suffering, and emergence from that with this joyful spirit and this, I mean, you're just a beautiful, beautiful girl with so much to offer. And I'm so glad you're doing it, what you're doing.
Thank you.
Because you could just, take off and go live somewhere and be I don't know, recluse somewhere. And that would be okay, but you're giving back, which is
don't think the thought has not crossed my mind.
Yeah.
To just go off in a cabin somewhere and live completely alone. And that sounds lovely to me. But I think it's just not in my character to do that for whatever reason. I have that truth teller spirit. And my partner even said to me, like, I've been through bad stuff. You've been through bad stuff. I just want to leave it behind. I don't want to live there anymore. And I said, well, I'm not living there. I think there are those people who are running the race and they trip and fall and they spend a lot of time on the ground with their face still on the ground going, this sucks. I hate it.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to do that. I don't want to live there. But what I do want to do is get up and plant a huge red flag in that hole and then stand up on a hill and say, hey, you guys, everybody, watch out for this red flag. It's there. I fell. It hurt. I didn't like it. Please don't fall for the same thing. 100%. I'm moving on, but at the same time, I'm like, hey, guys, there's this thing back there. Be careful.
Yeah. Well, it's like you're paving the way. You're kind of plowing through life the way that most of us do, which is, we don't know what's going on and we're just experiencing it. But you've been through some things that you can now, like I said, offer wisdom and say, you know what, I did this, I went through this happened to me, and I can help you not go there. Like, don't go where I did.
Yeah.
Don't do what I did. I mean, and then also you're offering, hey, but if you do, there's still hope,
Yeah.
And it's, people need to hear this. It's important. You have all these followers. Like, you have a huge following.
It's crazy.
It's gotta feel good. It's gotta feel good.
You know what feels really good is like the little individual messages and comments that I get from people, my one-on-one coaching clients who tell me their stories and I work with them for a while and they say, that was really helpful. Thank you. Like those are the things that are important to me. And when I think about like 10,000 followers is not that big, especially when you compare it to like, drinking.
That's 10,000 people that now have, I don't know, they're getting something from you, that even if it was 5 followers, it's those 5 people maybe are learning something that's helpful for them, or they're just experiencing it through you, that's beautiful. And it is those little, the people that reach out. Right before I came on this, I was getting a message from a girl who lives in India, and her name's Pinky, which is so cute.
That's cute.
She's been dealing with a narcissist, and I got into this Facebook group with narcissists, survivors of narcissistic relationships.
Mm.
And I just wanted to learn from them. Anyway, she just sort of latched onto me. And when she comes to me, whenever she starts to question if it's okay that she's stonewalling or gray rocking or whatever you do when you have to block and put up boundaries. And then she questions because she's this empathic, sweet person who doesn't want to be mean, even if the person's abusing her, right?
Right.
And I'm the person that tells her, no, you're doing the right thing. This is important. They don't feel about you the way you feel about them.
Right.
All they want is supply from you. They will suck you dry and leave you to die on the ground alone. Do not go there. And I'm always trying to, be the person to tell her that. And I think she gets it. She knows, like she watches Dr. Romney all day long and she knows all these things, but she still needs like a human to reach out to just, I don't know. And that's what I'm talking about, is that human touch. Even though we're hundreds and thousands of miles away, thanks to this technology we have, we can do that, which is beautiful.
Yeah, it is beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I wanna have you back on again, in a little while, a few months maybe or something, after you've sort of, I don't know, do you have a time frame for your books? And have you, while I was absent, did you tell people how to send their stories to you?
I did. I gave them my email, but I just said it.
Okay, that's perfect, because I'll put it in the show notes as well. And then while the show is going, I will put it in the comments as well.
Okay. I'm kind of shooting for like end of April, maybe May-ish, somewhere around there, to have the book, the manuscript ready to send it to an editor and move on from there.
Okay.
I don't want to spend too much time waiting on stories because it's getting really long already. I don't want it to be just this big slog.
Yeah.
I'm trying to put parts in between the stories that connect everything. It's tricky.
Yeah.
Kind of tricky what I'm trying to do. And then I get new stories all the time and I'm like, oh, where am I going to fit that one in? And how am I going to, so I don't want to keep it going for too long because then I'll lose my momentum. And I know how I work. I do better if I have a short window and then I really make it happen. So that's what I'm kind of looking at.
Yeah.
April-ish.
So you want people to have their stories to you by when?
Oh, just as soon as they can pull them together. Like I would say the deadline would probably be like mid-April.
Okay.
Mid-April, I'll still be working on the manuscript.
Okay.
And once I submit it, I'll probably, that'll be it. And I'll probably do that the first part of May.
Okay.
Okay.
Did I invite you to Generous Conference already?
No.
Okay. So I'm hosting a Generous Conference on the Friday before General Conference in Salt Lake City. I'm going to start at noon and I'm going to try to go. I would really love to go all the way to midnight, but I'm inviting other creators to submit, to either come on live that day or to submit in advance of a video recording of a message of kindness, inclusion, peace, love, whatever you want to put out into the world, so that I want to try to sort of give it the negative to what we experience from Salt Lake twice a year.
That you're like, here's the anecdote beforehand.
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your time.
Okay.
Just give us your email address one more time.
Okay. It's Lila, Lila, R as in rector, T as in Tueller. So Lila RT Designs with an S @yahoo.com.
Okay. And I will for sure put that in the show notes, and I'll put it in the comments. I'll pin it as a comment on this episode so that people can make sure to get in touch with you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lila.
For me. Thanks for inviting me on.
Of course. Yeah.
Good
Stay
day.
in touch.
I will. Bye-bye.
Bye.